Hello, fellow sapiens, and welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're walking under streetlights at midnight, curled under blankets while the wind taps at your window, or simply drifting through a moment of quiet curiosity, you're in the right place. Because tonight we're travelling deep into the Ice Age, to uncover how Neanderthals survived its unforgiving grip, until, at last, they didn't. This is contemplative storytelling and cold-forged science for those drawn to the long shadows of history. Ours is a forgotten story of survival, shaped by 100,000 winters, a buried jawbone, and the silence of melted snow. But it isn't a tale of weakness or inferiority. It's not the simple story you might expect. It begins not with failure, but with firelight. Oh, and if you're the kind of human who finds wonder in prehistoric puzzles and quiet revelations, consider tapping like and subscribe. It gently helps other thoughtful minds discover this slow, strange corner of the internet. Also, I'm curious, where are you listening from exactly? And what time is it for you right now? If you feel like sharing in the comments, it's a quiet reminder that we're all listening together, across continents and hours and lives. And hey, if you fall asleep during this story, that's perfectly fine. You'll find chapter markers waiting in the description. Now, we begin with a child curled in the snow, untouched for 50,000 years. The story of how Neanderthals survived the Ice Age, until they didn't, begins not with extinction, but with something far quieter. A child's body curled beneath layers of limestone in northern Spain, untouched for over 49,000 years. Hidden in the dim hush of El Cidron Cave, the remains offer no sign of violence, no shattered bone, no weapons trace, only stillness and cold and time. If survival is the story we came to hear, then this is the prologue etched in calcium and silence. What kind of world would leave behind such a body and such a question? The cave held 12 individuals in total, from an extended family, men, women and children, preserved not in ice, but in the whispering chill of cast stone. Their bones were not laid gently, they were broken, split in patterns so eerily consistent that researchers could not ignore the possibility of cannibalism. But beneath that possibility, beneath the mystery of the end, lies a greater one. How did they survive for hundreds of thousands of years before this? Because Neanderthals did not merely endure the Ice Age, they were shaped by it, sculpted in its image. They moved through a world of glaciers and mammoths, of bitter winds and short summers, not as lost cousins to modern humans, but as masters of survival. Their story is not a prelude to failure. It is a study in adaptation, a long and deliberate conversation between biology and landscape. At El Cidron, teeth tell tales. The child's dental enamel reveals more than diet. It holds the signature of seasonal hardship. Growth lines freeze mid-development, marking winters of starvation like rings in an ancient tree. Stress, recovery, stress again, and still survival. What happens when endurance becomes a way of life, not a moment of crisis, but a generational rhythm carved into the body? In those caves preserved by chemistry and chance, we do not find victims. We find people calibrated to their world. Thick-browed and broad-nosed, their skulls red like blueprints for heat retention. Their limbs, compact and muscular, whispered of strength rather than speed. Not for running, but for lifting, carrying, bracing. Not built for flight, but for staying. What does it mean to be designed not for escape, but for persistence? They hunted in frozen valleys where few dared to live. They tracked herds over ice-encrusted hills. They lit fires, made glue, chipped stone, not as accidents of cleverness, but as survival's quiet rituals. The child in the cave is not just a remnant. He is a message. He is a question. What kind of strength does it take to endure a world like that, generation after generation, until endurance itself becomes identity? And if the Ice Age gave rise to them, if cold carved them into being, what then does it mean that they still disappeared? To understand that paradox, we must first step back, not decades or centuries, but hundreds of thousands of years, into a landscape so alien it borders myth. During the Pleistocene, Earth was not stable. It breathed in ice and exhaled in floods. Temperatures shifted on a scale no modern civilization has known. Glaciers marched forward like slow-moving leviathans. scraping valleys bare, grinding stone into dust. Forests vanished beneath miles of ice. Rivers froze, split, changed course, and then, sometimes in only a few thousand years, warmth returned, only to recede again. This was the climate Neanderthals called home. Can you imagine what it means to build culture, memory and kinship on land that could vanish beneath a glacier in a single lifetime? How does a species learn to belong in a world that never settles? These Ice Age rhythms weren't minor inconveniences. They were tectonic forces shaping not just survival strategies, but the very architecture of the human body. The Neanderthals emerged roughly 400,000 years ago, diverging from a common ancestor they shared with Homo sapiens, likely Homo heidelbergensis, a species spread across Europe and Africa. But while some descendants of that lineage eventually walked out into savannas, chasing springtime and game, others stayed behind. In Europe, as the cold deepened, the ones who stayed changed. Adaptation is not instantaneous. It is pressure, endured. It is a failure, remember. The Neanderthals did not become cold-adapted superhumans overnight. Their transformation was written across generations, in the slow negotiation between body and world. Broader chests to store more heat, larger noses to warm frozen air before it reached the lungs, shorter limbs, closer to the heart, to conserve warmth. And yet, is it enough to reshape bone and blood? What of thought, of culture, of spirit? In the stillness of El Sidron, we do not find crude brutes, we find care. We find teeth worn smooth, likely used to soften hides or hold tools, hinting at a shared burden. We find evidence that some in the group lived with injury or disease long enough to suggest others helped them survive. What happens when survival stops being individual? Perhaps the better question is, when did it begin? Because to endure cold like this, true cold, the kind that kills not in days but in breaths, requires more than anatomy. It requires fire. It requires planning. It requires others. The child in the cave was not alone, not in death, and likely not in life. His bones lie beside family, a unit, a band, a tribe. Not just surviving, but surviving together. In a climate that shifted like breath, they became stillness. In a world that howled, they built silence. But can even the best adaptations hold against a climate that never stops changing? What happens when the very thing that forged you begins to betray you? The answer is written not in a single event, but in layers of time, the way ice builds its story, one snowfall at a time. When scientists crawled into the narrow chambers of El Sidron, they weren't simply excavating bones. They were unearthing an environment, a climate, and a rhythm of living so alien that even words struggle to hold it. Imagine the light, a blue-grey twilight that lasted for months. Imagine the sound, wind scouring open plains, the muted cracking of frozen rivers, the low thunder of migrating herds whose very survival mirrored your own. This was the cradle and the crucible of Neanderthal life. Why begin with the child? Because children, more than adults, record in their bones the story of their world. The enamel lines on his teeth showed repeated interruptions, as if winter itself had reached inside his mouth and pressed pause. Malnutrition, disease, cold stress. He survived each, until one day he didn't. Yet the fact that he survived so many at all is testimony to something greater than luck. It speaks of a pattern, sheltering, feeding, tending, a network of care extending far beyond the self. For the Neanderthals, the Ice Age was not a single trial. It was a canvas. They painted their existence on it with stone, fire, and blood. When glaciers advanced, they moved. When forests died, they followed rivers, carving new paths into their minds as well as the earth. Their world was a moving puzzle, and to live was to constantly reassemble its pieces. What must it have felt like to raise a child under such conditions, knowing that even your greatest skill might not outpace the sky's next whim? Would you have told stories at night, by the hearth, of ancestors who had endured worse storms, colder winds, deeper hunger? Did those stories become a kind of inheritance, not just tools but memory made portable? At El Sidron the band's remains are strangely fragmented, as if someone had broken bones to reach marrow, a sign either of starvation or of ritual. To us, in a modern kitchen, such an act seems brutal. But in the Ice Age, survival was a different morality. It was a calculus of immediacy, of taking from the dead what might allow the living to continue. And yet, even amid that possibility, the dead were not discarded. They were placed, however haphazardly, together. Perhaps there was still meaning, even in necessity. This is the paradox of Neanderthal life. Their world was harsh, but their responses were not mindless. Their adaptations were deliberate. Their persistence was a kind of intelligence, written not only in tools but in relationships. If survival is a story, theirs was one of cooperation and endurance. But if cooperation was their greatest strength, might it also have been their most fragile hope, stretched thin by a climate that demanded more and more? What do we inherit from a species that turned hardship into habit? Perhaps more than we care to admit. Not just in genes, though those remain silent and folded inside the double helix of many modern humans, but in instincts, in reactions, in the bone-deep memory of how to endure. Neanderthals were not our ancestors in a straight line, but they are kin, and the patterns they laid down, the strategies they employed, the decisions they made beneath that long Ice Age sky, live on as faint echoes in us. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we must return again to the cold. Not the romantic cold of snowfall or a morning frost, but the deep planetary cold that grips entire continents. The kind of cold that changes not just what you wear, but how you think. The kind of cold that buries rivers beneath ice sheets 1 mile thick, that drives animals into extinction and turns whole ecosystems into treeless, grassless silence. This is not the background of the Neanderthal story. It is the story. The Pleistocene was a world in flux. Across its 2.5 million years, Earth swung between warm interglacial periods and catastrophic glacial advances. For over 300,000 of those years, Neanderthals endured in Europe, through no fewer than 8 full glacial cycles. That is not a coincidence. That is commitment. That is deep time resilience. But survival in such a world does not mean waiting for spring. It means learning to live inside winter. Neanderthals adapted not just biologically but behaviourally. Archaeological evidence suggests they planned for seasonal changes, moving between known shelter sites, adjusting hunting strategies, even timing childbirth to align with more favourable seasons. In such a volatile world, even birth became a strategy, and strategy left its mark. In Spain, France, Belgium, and beyond, researchers find fire-blackened hearths, piles of carefully flaked stone tools, butchered animal remains sorted with almost surgical attention. They find traces of ochre, perhaps used for tanning hides, or perhaps for something more symbolic. They find evidence of foresight, of people who didn't merely react to the cold but anticipated it. Who thought ahead? What is the shape of a mind that must always look one season forward? Neanderthal technology, once dismissed as crude, now reveals an astonishing precision. Mousterian tools, named for the site of Le Moustier in France, were not simple flakes, but purpose-driven blades, scrapers, and points. Many were made with the Levallois technique, a complex method requiring planning, symmetry, and spatial awareness. Each tool carried intent, yet even more than tools, perhaps it was fire that defined their defiance of cold. Fire wasn't just warmth, it was safety, signal, sustenance. It turned raw meat into nourishment and dark nights into moments of communion. In a landscape where the environment was an ever-shifting enemy, fire became an anchor, a statement. We are still here. But can fire push back ice forever? What happens when the cold outpaces even the most ancient flame? Perhaps it doesn't arrive as catastrophe, but as erosion. Not a single blizzard or final freeze, but a slow, imperceptible unravelling. Fewer elk one season, thinner fur on the hides, an extra day of darkness each winter. Adaptation has limits, and the Pleistocene tested them all. What's extraordinary is not that Neanderthals eventually disappeared. It's how long they endured before they did. In the archaeological record, extinction leaves few dramatic scenes. No final battle, no sudden silence, just absence. One layer holds hearth ash and butchered bone, the next holds none. And beneath this apparent quiet is a question far older than any artifact. Why? Why did a species that had mastered cold, that had survived for 400,000 years, vanish, while we, their tropical cousins, survived. El Sidron offers no answers, only presence, only the trace of life still. But in that stillness is the beginning of our own curiosity. The modern sapien sits at a strange vantage point, alive because of a chain of survival that stretches backward into frozen valleys and mammoth hunts and whispered songs beside firelight. When you peer into the face of a Neanderthal child, you're not looking at failure. You're looking at kin. You're looking at someone who made it almost all the way through, and still something changed. It would be tens of thousands of years before that change became total, before the Neanderthals, once scattered across Europe and the Near East, became only bones, shadows, and strands of DNA in our blood. But already, even in El Sidron, the signs were there. The cold was sharpening, landscapes were shifting, and in the south, another kind of human was beginning to appear. That part of the story, the part about us, will come later. For now, it is enough to linger here, in the cave, to imagine the moment before extinction, when survival still felt possible, to feel the hush of snow above stone, to picture a mother's hand brushing dirt from a child's brow, not knowing she would be remembered. Because the central mystery isn't why they died, it's how they lived so long, 400,000 years, through ice, through flood. Through famine, they built homes, buried their dead, healed the wounded, learned to tame flame and follow stars they couldn't name. They were not waiting to become us, they were already enough. So when we ask how Neanderthals survived the Ice Age, until they didn't, we're asking not about disappearance, but about presence. We're asking how, against every cold and shifting obstacle, they remained. For so long, so silently, so close. And perhaps the deeper question is not what ended them, but whether we too would last that long, in a world made of snow and silence and time. They did not stumble into the Ice Age. They emerged from it. To say the Neanderthals survived the cold is to miss the truth entirely. They were not refugees from warmth, not wanderers from gentler lands driven northward by misfortune. They were born of frost, sculpted by it. Their story begins not at the edge of glaciation, but deep within its breath, in a world where winter was not a season, but a continent-spanning reality. They did not endure the cold. They were the cold's creation. This is the Pleistocene, the great shaper, stretching from around 2.5 million years ago to a mere 12,000 years before our present. It was a time defined by extremes, not a single frozen epoch, but a rhythm, a pulse, ice advancing, then retreating, glaciers surging like slow white rivers, then melting back into valleys, forests replaced by steppe, steppe replaced by ice, again and again and again. Entire ecosystems shattered and reformed on a timescale that broke the boundaries of species. Evolution was not optional, it was required. In the middle of this geological symphony, one lineage of hominin began to take on the traits we would one day call Neanderthal. From Homo heidelbergensis, itself a hardy, tool-using ancestor, emerged a new adaptation to the cold, tailored not in decades or even millennia, but in the slow arithmetic of generations. Europe during the Middle Pleistocene was no place for fragility. It demanded a body that could resist, endure, and respond. And so, the Neanderthals became that body. Imagine standing beside one. Not the hunched caricature, but the reality. Shorter than modern humans, yes, but thicker, heavier. Their chests barreled and wide like bellows engineered for life in freezing air. Their arms are powerful. Their thighs are like coiled cables. A neck thick to guard heat. A face broad and angled with a great projecting nose. Not for aesthetics, but for physics. To humidify and warm breath before it reached the lungs. A living furnace. A body designed not for running, but for holding ground. Every inch of that frame whispered adaptation. Not just strength, but purpose. The Pleistocene did not forgive waste. Longer limbs would have lost too much heat. A taller body would have required more calories. Neanderthals were a compromise between mass and efficiency, speed and power, exposure and conservation. They were, quite literally, built for the ice. But what kind of world would demand such precision? A world where seasons weren't just inconvenient but lethal. Where the sun might rise for months and still offer no warmth. Where mammoths trudged through permafrost and entire forests turned to bone-white dust when the temperature dipped. This was not a land to visit. It was a crucible. And in that crucible, something ancient was forged. Not just a body, but a way of being. The Neanderthals did not merely survive cold, they lived in concert with it. To us, the Ice Age feels like an apocalypse, a frozen silence punctuated by howling winds and skeletal trees. But to them, it was the only world they knew. What we see as scarcity, they understood as rhythm. What we call harsh, they may have called home. The environmental pressure of glacial Europe was relentless. Between 400,000 and 300,000 years ago, during the Middle Pleistocene, continental glaciers repeatedly surged across Eurasia, descending from the north like great white machines. These weren't seasonal snowfalls, they were geological events, burying entire landscapes under ice sheets up to 2 kilometers thick. In their wake came tundra and steppe, wind-blasted and dry, dotted with patches of hardy grass and scattered prey. Life here was not impossible, but it was conditional. Each year offered one question: can you find enough to eat before the cold returns? For most species, the answer was often no. But Neanderthals learned to track that question through time. They became expert seasonal readers, interpreting the behaviours of animals, the swell of rivers, the shape of clouds against the sky. Their relationship to the land was not one of dominance, but of careful observation. It was this pressure that sculpted not just their bodies, but their culture. And in cold climates, mistakes are rarely forgiven. Tools must be efficient. Movements must have meaning. There is no energy to spare on improvisation. And so, their technology, stone flakes, hand axes, hafted points, became refined, durable, and repeatable. Their skills were passed down through generations like whispered prayers, each one a survival strategy written in flint. Even their pace, we suspect, matched the rhythm of the land. Patience, not speed, defined their world. A mammoth might take days to track. A single successful hunt might feed a group for a week. Time itself froze into slowness, and within that slowness, adaptation found room to work. Every bone, every joint, every behavioural trait that couldn't serve the cold fell away across the generations. Until what remained was something uniquely suited to this ancient Europe, something we would one day call Neanderthal. But even the strongest adaptations leave questions. Why them? Why here? Why did this particular lineage in this frozen corner of the world not only survive but thrive for hundreds of thousands of years? Was it chance? Was it the right combination of anatomy and instinct? Or something more elusive, something hidden in the folds of memory and meaning? The bones can't answer, but they suggest, they hint, they offer silhouettes in sediment, a femur here, a skull cap there, a nasal cavity widened by generations of breath drawn from frigid air. The record is incomplete, but it is unmistakable. The cold did not chase them, the cold called them, and they answered. But answering meant more than anatomy, it meant lineage. It meant origin. Because before there were Neanderthals, there was something else, a transitional echo, a precursor walking the blurred line between what was and what would be. That shadow was Homo heidelbergensis, an ancestor that roamed both Africa and Europe nearly 700,000 years ago. They were tall, robust, and clever. They chipped stone with intent, hunted in groups, and may have mastered the early whispers of fire. But they were not yet Neanderthal. In Europe, something changed. Isolated by terrain, by climate, and perhaps by timing itself, one branch of Homo heidelbergensis became something more. Generation by generation, their bodies shifted under the chisel of natural selection. Glacial cycles filtered their traits like wind across sand, removing what failed, refining what remained. And from this long sculpting emerged Homo neanderthalensis. It was not an abrupt birth. There was no single moment when a child looked different and was suddenly new. Evolution doesn't offer such clean lines. It draws in smudges and soft transitions. The Neanderthals emerged slowly, almost imperceptibly, over hundreds of thousands of years. Yet what emerged was not ambiguous. By 400,000 years ago, their form was taking shape, already different from us in crucial ways. We often imagine the story of human evolution as a ladder, rung after rung toward progress. But it is not a ladder. It is a tree, a branching, tangled, ever-shifting tree where multiple species exist at once, diverging and converging, some leading to us, others to silence. Neanderthals were not a failed version of us. They were a successful version of themselves. For longer than our own species has existed, they mastered a continent we could barely enter, and the body they carried through that world was a monument to adaptation. Their limb proportions, short tibias, broad pelvises, thick joints, were not clumsy. They were thermodynamic. Every square centimetre of their skin, every vessel beneath, existed in relationship to heat. Heat preserved, heat lost, heat hoarded in muscle, in marrow, in the cave-dark quiet of rest. Even their skulls tell the tale. The classic sloped forehead, the pronounced brow ridge, the occipital bun, each feature born not from accident, but from a long conversation with climate and necessity. Their brains were as large as ours, sometimes larger, yet shaped differently, perhaps organised differently. What thoughts passed through those differently curved corridors of cognition? What dreams flickered behind those heavy lids? We do not know, but what we do know is this. The Pleistocene did not allow indulgence. If a trait existed, it existed for a reason. It was earned. And so their very silhouette became iconic, a presence at once familiar and foreign. The heavy jaw, the strong neck, the thick fingers wrapped around stone and sinew. They're a figure forged not by culture alone, but by the pure force of ice and time. What kind of mind grows inside a body built to resist the cold? A mind that remembers, a mind that watches, a mind that builds not cities or empires but continuity, across winters, across generations. The Neanderthal brain, though shaped differently from ours, was not lesser. Its volume matched or exceeded that of modern humans. What differed, perhaps, was structure, and from structure, function. Did they think more in space than in time? Did they see the world as a map of scent, of texture, of pattern in migration and shadow? Intelligence is not always measured in words. Sometimes it's measured in silence, in observation, in the ability to act precisely when the moment allows and not before. And in the Ice Age, that kind of precision was survival itself. Neanderthals did not build civilizations in the way we define them, but they lived in civilizations of ice and instinct, bound to the land through memory, through ritual, through necessity. Their knowledge was intimate. A reindeer trail known by the bend of a branch. A cave remembered not by coordinates, but by the sound the wind made at its mouth. This was embodied knowledge, carried in sinew, passed in gesture, reinforced by doing. Their tools reflected this embedded wisdom. The Mousterian toolkit, named for a site in France, was not crude. It was efficient, minimal, designed for the lives they led. Their flint scrapers, points, and blades were standardized across vast regions, suggesting cultural transmission and teaching. Hands shaping younger hands, each movement honed over time, and it was time they had. Hundreds of thousands of years to perfect the rhythm of their existence. It is easy to forget how long that is. All of recorded human history fits into a tenth of that span. From the first Sumerian tablet to the satellites above us, a blink compared to the length of Neanderthal endurance. Through ice ages, interglacials, shifting fauna and flora, they remained. But what did that constancy feel like? Perhaps it felt like vigilance, like the tension of always being near the edge of what is possible. Every winter a test, every child born into a world where survival was not assumed, but earned. That pressure leaves marks, not just on bones, but on culture, on the inner world of a people. They likely spoke, though no record of their voice remains. Their hyoid bones, the structure of their throats and inner ears, suggest vocal capability. DNA even hints at FOXP2, the so-called language gene, present in modern humans. If they had language, and the evidence grows that they did, it would have served as the glue of survival, calling across the hunt, soothing a child, teaching the next generation when and where the herds would pass. Words shaped by wind, by hunger, by closeness. What is language? After all, if not a tool for preserving memory, for transmitting warmth across time, and in a world so cold, memory may have been the warmest thing they had. Because survival wasn't just about blood and bone. It was about belonging, about recognizing faces in the firelight, about returning to the same valley year after year and knowing it not as territory, but as home. The Neanderthals didn't wander blindly across the ice. They moved with intention, tethered to landscapes etched with ancestral roots, shelters known by generations, hunting grounds shared by memory. This was not aimless roaming. This was seasonal choreography, as practiced and precise as any migration written into the wings of birds. And so, the cold that shaped their limbs also shaped their hearts. Their capacity for empathy, for social cohesion, was not a luxury. It was an evolutionary necessity. A lone Neanderthal could not endure the ice, but a group, a band of kin, could share warmth, food, labour, even sorrow. The archaeological record shows signs of the injured surviving for years beyond wounds that would have incapacitated them, shattered limbs, degenerative disease. Someone must have cared, someone must have carried, someone must have stayed behind to keep the fire lit. That, too, is adaptation. Their bodies were thermal architecture, their tools were extensions of memory, their minds were shaped by the rhythm of frost and fire, and all of it was forged by ice. We often ask why the Neanderthals disappeared, but the better question, the more staggering one, is why they survived as long as they did. In a world that would erase almost everything, they held on for over 400,000 years, through storms we cannot imagine, through landscapes that have since drowned beneath rising seas or vanished beneath farmland and city sprawl. Their presence across deep time was not accidental. It was earned over and over again. And perhaps this is the most important truth of all. They didn't survive in spite of the cold. They survived because of it. The ice did not only test them, it made them. It was their teacher, their sculptor, their mirror. And in responding to its demands, and growing broader, thicker, more deliberate, more communal, the Neanderthals became something entirely their own. Not a stepping stone on the way to us, but a complete chapter in the story of what it means to be human. To understand their form is not to measure deviation from a modern standard. It is to witness a masterwork of evolution, a lineage tuned from brow to heel for a world we can barely imagine. A world of long winters and dim sunlight, of steady breath drawn from frozen air. A world that, for hundreds of thousands of years, they called home. And in that home they did not merely endure, they belonged. So when we speak of the Ice Age, we must speak of them, not as shadows, not as relics, but as people, forged by ice. To survive the Ice Age was not only to endure cold, but to find light within it. And so the Neanderthals held fire in their hands. They did not stumble upon it. They tended it, nurtured it, protected it with a vigilance born of necessity and reverence. In a world where warmth could mean the difference between memory and erasure, fire was not just heat, it was continuity. It was breath. It was time slowed into ember, and at the centre of that flame, a species shaped by ice wrote its legacy in smoke. If Neanderthals were forged by cold, then fire was their answer to it, an answer that burned not with dominance, but with devotion. Across caves from Spain to Israel, archaeologists have uncovered the quiet evidence of this relationship. Blackened sediment layers, heat-fractured stones, charcoal traces buried deep in hearth-shaped depressions. Some sites show fire use spanning tens of thousands of years, in the same darkened corners, again and again, as if each generation returned to the same place, rekindling what had been kept before. This was not incidental, this was planned, maintained, controlled. The caves themselves whisper the story. The fire was placed carefully, often near wind-protected walls, positioned to warm not just bodies, but community. In the patterns of soot, in the spatial layout of tools and bones, we see a choreography, cooking, flint-knapping, sleeping, feeding, all orbiting a glowing core. What does it mean to build your life around fire? The evidence suggests this wasn't a rare skill. It was a shared one. At multiple sites, Pech de Lazé in France, Bruniquel in southern Europe, Neanderthal fire use appears methodical. They selected dry wood. They controlled oxygen flow. They organised hearths in ways that suggest experience. Perhaps they learned through demonstration. Perhaps a grandparent sat beside a child, showing them how to stack branches, how to read the smoke, how to know when to feed the flame and when to leave it alone. This was a technology of rhythm, not conquest. It moved with the body, with breath, with need, and around that fire something deeper formed. Imagine it. Night falls early in Ice Age Europe. The cold presses at the cave mouth like a silent predator. Inside there is flickering warmth, Shadows ripple on the limestone, someone feeds the fire, someone else scrapes marrow from bone. A child sleeps, an elder remembers, the world is harsh. But here, there is centre, there is pattern, there is light. What happens to the human mind when it discovers flame not as accident but as companion? Not as a brief gift from lightning, but as a presence to be kept alive, hour after hour, day after day. In a continent ruled by darkness and ice, the hearth was not just survival, it was a claim. We are still here, we remember, we remain. Because fire was not just a flickering necessity. It was a boundary between the living and the cold, between the known and the wild, between forgetfulness and memory. The Neanderthals, more than mere users of flame, became its stewards, and through fire they extended their reach, not into empire, not into conquest, but into permanence. What they built was not grand, but it endured, precisely because it was small, repeatable, passed from hand to hand like an ember wrapped in bark. There are hearths older than writing, older than names. In sites like Grotta du Lazare or Kabara Cave, dark stains mark the ground in soft oval hollows where fires once smouldered. Beneath layers of ash, archaeologists find bones split for marrow, stone tools still flaked by pressure, flakes of ochre possibly used for body paint or ritual. These are not campsites, they are centres, anchors of habitation. If the cold made the land vast and empty, then the hearth made a room inside that void, a circle where meaning gathered, and Neanderthals did more than burn wood. They transformed materials with it. One of the most extraordinary traces they left behind was something invisible to the naked eye: birch tar. At first glance, it may seem inconsequential, but birch tar, a sticky black adhesive made by heating birch bark in low oxygen conditions, is not an accident. It is chemistry. It requires fire to be managed, hidden from air, carefully enclosed. It demands intention. The birch tar they created was used to haft stone points to wooden handles, to bind tool and limb, to turn two objects into one instrument. What this reveals is breathtaking. That Neanderthals not only controlled fire, but understood its transformative power. They didn't just warm themselves, they altered matter. They made composite tools, a leap in cognitive complexity once thought beyond their reach. But the tar remains, quietly insisting otherwise. And this kind of knowledge doesn't happen in isolation. It must be taught, shared, refined. The process is delicate, the conditions narrow. Too much oxygen, and the bark burns. Too little heat, and the resin never flows. Somewhere, across tens of thousands of years, Neanderthals learned how to do this, and how to do it reliably. How many attempts did it take? How many evenings crouched over a glowing bed of coals, adjusting bark and stone until the black gold emerged? Fire became more than warmth. It became memory made tangible, a medium of learning, a place of return. And through its smoke, something intangible began to rise. What does it mean when fire is no longer just a reaction to the cold, but a vessel for thought? What does it mean when the first human technology is not a tool or a weapon, but light? It means that before language was written, before walls held paintings, before gods had names, there was fire, and around it, the first rituals of presence. A circle of light that invited bodies to draw near, that allowed faces to be seen, that held the unknown at bay. For Neanderthals, fire was not simply function, it was centre. In its glow, time softened. Food became nourishment. Stories, if they were told, unfolded in smoke. And this is the quiet revelation. The hearth was not only about survival, it was about belonging. Across Europe, sites reveal spatial organisation that speaks to more than instinct. At Lazaret Cave, near the Mediterranean coast, evidence suggests fire was placed near rear walls, where heat would linger longer. Sleeping spaces appear to radiate outward. Tool-making debris gathers in arcs, not scattered but arranged. There is order here, deliberation, a sense of space not just used but understood. This spatial awareness implies something else, shared experience. The fire doesn't just warm, it connects. In its light, you can see a hand move, a gesture made, a face wrinkle with thought. Fire allowed for visibility, and with visibility came empathy. To watch another being shiver and offer them warmth, that is more than instinct. That is social cognition. That is recognition of the other. And from recognition, perhaps, came reflection. What happened in the evenings, when the hunt was over and the world fell quiet? Did they sit in silence, breathing the scent of smoke and bone? Did they laugh? Did they mourn? The fire provided a rare gift in the Ice Age: time. Time not spent hunting, not fleeing, not scavenging, but simply being. And in that suspended warmth something could grow. The stirrings of imagination, the layering of memory, the sense that life was more than immediate need. Around the hearth, the Neanderthals weren't just surviving. They were thinking. And this thinking wasn't abstract. It was grounded in the elemental. In fire they found a teacher, of cycles, of patience, of consequence. Feed it too little, and it dies. Feed it too much, and it burns uncontrolled. Flame taught balance, flame taught timing, and in learning to keep it alive they may have learned to see themselves differently. Fire marks a shift, a threshold between animal and human. Not because it made us powerful, but because it made us attentive. It required us to tend, to watch, to anticipate. What other things did Neanderthals learn to tend? If they could nurture fire, could they nurture grief? Could they nurture memory? Could they nurture each other? Perhaps this is the deeper meaning flickering beneath the soot-streaked walls, that the fire was not simply heat, but the first mirror, a mirror in which they saw not the world, but themselves, lit from within. Because when the cold world outside offered only darkness, the hearth offered a way to hold a fragment of the sun. The glow of fire did not simply illuminate stone walls, it illuminated thought itself. Within those wavering shadows, the Neanderthals began to weave something invisible but enduring, a sense of shared time. Fire burned continuously, uniting hours into a single thread. Day became night, night became day, and the flame remained, a heartbeat inside the cave. Archaeologists can trace this heartbeat in the soot patterns left behind. Layers of ash, punctuated by seasons, reveal repeated occupation. The blackened ceilings of caves tell us the fires burned hot and long. The arrangement of stones sometimes hints at hearth borders, deliberate constructions meant to contain flame. This was not casual fire use, it was domestic fire use, with all the implications that word carries. Domesticated not in the sense of ownership, but of intimacy. And what intimacy it must have been. Around that hearth, food was roasted, sinew softened, bones cracked for marrow. Tools were reshaped by the glow, birch tar distilled in quiet experiments. Children played in the warmth. Elders dozed with eyes half open, the firelight flickering across heavy brows. Perhaps someone hummed. Perhaps someone marked time by feeding the flame, measuring its life as they measured their own. What changes in a mind when life becomes centered around a fire? It teaches planning. It teaches patience. It creates space for repetition, and repetition is the seedbed of culture. To pass down a method for making tar. To hand a child a stick and show them how to turn it so it catches, not smothers the flame. To remember which woods burn slow, which burn fast, which smoke, which spark. Each small choice a moment of learning. Each moment a step away from accident and toward mastery. And mastery is not simply technical, it is emotional. Fire needs care, it rewards attention, it punishes neglect. To keep it alive through a freezing night is to be awake, to be watchful, to be mindful. This is a kind of discipline, a kind of awareness, and awareness is what makes thought possible. In a world where death was always near, fire offered something like continuity. Even as individuals died, even as groups scattered, the skill of tending flame endured, a lineage of heat moving forward through time. It was not just a technology, but a tradition, the first inheritance carried not in genes but in practice. How many hands over hundreds of thousands of years have cupped embers, have coaxed sparks into flame, have watched firelight dance across a loved one's face? And how many of those moments have vanished into ash, leaving only the faint black traces we read today? Those traces are humble, a smear of charcoal, a reddened stone, a chemical signature buried beneath soil and centuries, yet they are echoes of something vast, a shared intimacy between Neanderthal and flame, written not in language, but in warmth. Fire was not just survival, it was sanctuary. And within its glow, something human took root. Not human as in modern, but human as in present. A being who feels, who remembers, who gathers others close when the wind howls outside. For Neanderthals, fire shaped more than just space. It shaped time. It allowed for pauses, for continuity, for rituals that left no artifact but lived in rhythm. Feeding the fire at dusk, sitting in silence as the sparks rose, watching a child's eyes reflect the flame, knowing that they too would carry this knowledge forward. In a world with no clocks, no calendars, the fire was time made visible. And it was also meaning made visible. In the darkness of Brunikel Cave, far beyond the reach of natural light, Neanderthals arranged broken stalagmites in circular patterns, their surfaces scorched by flame. The purpose remains mysterious. Was it ritual? Was it memory? Was it a conversation with the earth itself? Whatever it was, it tells us this. Fire went where nothing else could go. It lit not only the living spaces, but the inner caves, the inner mind. There is something poetic and true in imagining that Neanderthals didn't just survive the cold, but made of that survival a kind of art. An art that did not seek permanence in monuments or markings, but in the act of tending a flame, tending a bond, tending life. And though their voices are gone and their stories untold, the ashes remain. In every hearth we uncover, we see the same gesture, hands moving through darkness, creating warmth, creating continuity. It is the oldest story we have, and it is still ours, because we too are children of the fire. We inherit their embers, not just in our genes, but in the way we gather, the way we sit in circles, the way we tell stories when the lights go low. The hearth is still with us, in every campfire, in every candle, in the hush that falls when flame becomes the only light in the room. The Neanderthals held the fire in their hands, and in doing so they held on to each other. They held on to meaning. They held on to the fragile miracle of life in a world of ice. And though they are gone, their fire still burns, in us. Not as smoke, not as ash, but as memory, as warmth, as light. To survive the Ice Age was to become a predator. Not a scavenger scraping at the edge of carrion, but a strategist, a stalker, a creature of brutal intelligence in a world that yielded nothing freely. The Neanderthals did not endure the cold by waiting for death to deliver them meat. They met it head-on. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, bison the size of small trucks. These were not hunted from afar, not pierced with arrows from the safety of distance. They were met up close, with muscle, with coordination, and with a clarity of purpose so honed it bordered on terrifying. What kind of mind does it take to walk toward a beast whose breath mists like steam engines and whose tusks could impale a man? What kind of heart steadies its beat when the charge begins, not from the predator, but from the prey? The answer begins in stone. Neanderthal weaponry, often classified under the Mousterian toolkit, was deceptively simple at first glance. No long-range spears, no bows, just sharp edges, hafted points, and thick wooden shafts designed not to saw but to stab. The weapons they crafted were tools of proximity, thrusting spears, not throwing ones, flint flakes that could pierce hide, but only if you got close enough to smell the animal's breath. This alone rewrites the myth of the primitive brute. To hunt like this was not reckless, it was calculated, it was rehearsed, it was surgical. And so, we must ask, what allowed them to do it? The evidence lies buried in the bones, not only of the animals they hunted, but in their own. Forensic anthropology reads these bodies like crime scenes. Neanderthal skeletons show trauma patterns that mirror those of modern rodeo riders, injuries to the upper body, to the ribs, to the shoulders. These are not the wounds of ambushes or distant shots. They are the wounds of collisions, of grappling, of standing your ground as 200 pounds of meat and horn bears down on you with enough force to crush bone. And yet they returned from the hunt again and again. This was not accident. This was strategy. What kind of coordination did that require? Imagine a valley, ringed by snow-frosted pines. A herd of reindeer moves slowly across the tundra, wary, alert. Neanderthals wait in silence, already in position, having predicted the migration path days in advance. One group drives the herd forward, another lies in wait. There are no words as we know them, but there is communication. Subtle, refined, embodied. A glance, a grunt, a hand signal, rehearsed 1,000 times in hunts before, and then motion. A flood of bodies erupting from behind rocks and trees. Spears lift, the chase begins. How does a species evolve not just the muscle to strike, but the trust to strike together? That question lives in the marrow of Neanderthal life. For hunting at close range was not an act of individual bravery. It was a choreography of risk shared by all. One mistake and the spear could break, a comrade could fall, the herd could scatter. Yet across tens of thousands of years the pattern repeats. Bones of mammoth, bison, reindeer, and even giant deer found alongside Neanderthal tools, fractured and burned in hearths. These were not scavenged carcasses abandoned by predators. The cut marks on the bones tell the story. They begin at joints, at muscle attachments, exactly where a butcher's hand would start. They speak of fresh kills, not second-hand scraps. And in those marks we see skill. Skill born of practice, handed from one generation to the next. The Mousterian toolkit was an extension of this skill. Though its spear points lacked the aerodynamic refinement of later Homo sapiens weapons, they were crafted for durability and penetration at close quarters. The edges of the flint reveal careful retouching, symmetry and standardization. These were not random flakes chipped off in haste. They were purposeful, honed. The hafting of stone into wood, often secured with sinew or birch tar adhesive, transformed them from simple points into true spears capable of piercing hide thick as armour. This was no small feat. Birch tar required controlled fire, patience, and foresight. To produce it, bark had to be heated in low oxygen conditions, carefully insulated to prevent combustion, and collected as it oozed from the process. It was chemistry without a chemist's name, a craft without writing, but not without mastery. Each spear point bearing such adhesive is an archaeological whisper of planning and knowledge, and of cooperation, for such production likely took more than one set of hands. But the spears themselves were only the beginning. It was how they were used that mattered. Hunting in Ice Age Europe was not a lone endeavour. It was the culmination of observation, tracking, ambush and strike. The prey was larger, faster, and often more dangerous than the hunters. One misstep could shatter a femur or crush a rib cage. The trauma patterns in Neanderthal remains confirm it. Broken bones healed, old injuries carried for years. Someone had to care for the wounded when the hunt was over. Someone had to feed them, keep them warm, keep them alive. That too was part of the hunt. This blend of risk and care tells us something profound about Neanderthal society. They were not simply hunters, they were networks of interdependence. Success depended on coordination. Coordination depended on trust. Trust required memory. A shared sense of who had stood beside you before, who would stand beside you again. In a frozen world where hunger was constant and prey could kill as easily as feed, this trust was not optional. It was as vital as the spear in the hand. What does it mean when survival itself becomes a test of communal memory? It means that hunting was never just an act of violence. It was an act of knowledge, remembered trails, habitual migration routes, watering holes, and seasonal behaviours passed down not through books or maps, but through stories, gestures, and lived repetition. The Neanderthals had no written language, but they had landscape memory. They knew where the mammoth herds would move when the wind shifted. They knew which valleys trapped animals, which ridges gave the best view, which river crossings became bottlenecks in spring melt. These were not random facts. They were survival etched into mind and muscle. The Ice Age environment was not forgiving. Glacial cycles brought swings of intense cold and brief warming, often shifting rapidly within a generation. Forests turned to tundra, rivers froze and rerouted, and yet Neanderthals endured, not by remaining static, but by adapting their strategies to changing prey and terrain. When mammoth became rare, they turned to reindeer. When herds moved, so did they. Their hunting toolkit, though superficially unchanged over millennia, was flexible enough to accommodate new needs. Scrapers and points were reshaped, flakes retouched for different cuts, fire logs chosen for varied burn times depending on the season. But perhaps the most remarkable adaptation was not in stone or bone, it was in how they hunted together. Recent studies of cut-marked animal bones suggest strategic butchery by multiple individuals. Some processed limbs, others removed fat-rich organs. There was division of labour even in death. Some may have carried meat back to camp, others guarded the site. There is evidence that carcasses were dismembered in stages, portions cached and returned to later. This is not just practicality, it's planning, the kind that requires communication, trust, and intention over time. Even more striking are the signs of pre-kill coordination. In some kill sites, like the famed La Borde in France, large numbers of bison were taken in a single event. The layout of the remains and associated tools suggest the use of natural topography to trap and funnel the animals, perhaps even using fire or noise to direct movement. This level of tactical forethought blurs the line between instinct and strategy. It implies not only an understanding of prey behaviour, but a shared ability to manipulate it. What language was used to coordinate such a thing? We will never know. But the success of these hunts, and their repetition over time, implies a shared code. Perhaps not words, but signals, postures, rhythms of movement. The body itself became the text, read fluently by those who had grown up learning its syntax. A raised hand might halt a charge, a low whistle might send a flank into motion, and all of it built upon trust, that your group would act in concert, that your life was held in the balance of others. In this way, hunting became a form of collective intelligence, not thought as a solitary spark, but as a fire passed between many minds. And in that shared fire, we see the emergence of something deeper than mere coordination, social cohesion forged in the crucible of necessity. Neanderthals hunted because they had to, but how they hunted reveals who they were. The demands of the hunt were not simply physical, they were cognitive, emotional, and social. They required not just strength, but anticipation. Not just proximity, but protection. Not just action, but reaction. Subtle, fast, unspoken. This is where the hunting injuries take on another meaning. A fractured rib is not only evidence of danger, it is a clue to the social safety net that followed. Many Neanderthal skeletons show signs of serious trauma, crushed bones, healed fractures, degenerative injuries, yet they lived long after the wounds. These weren't individuals left to die. They were cared for, fed, sheltered. That means others had to hunt more, carry more, share more. The hunt extended beyond the moment of the kill. It extended into healing, into memory, into obligation. This deep web of mutual dependence gave Neanderthals something most predators lack: resilience. Because the truth of the hunt is this: it fails more than it succeeds. A missed strike, a shift in wind, an animal that senses danger too soon. Hunger becomes sharper, spirits sag, the spear is reused, the group regroups, and yet they returned, again and again, across hundreds of thousands of years. The archaeology doesn't lie. From the Iberian Peninsula to the windswept steppes of Eurasia, Mousterian tools and butchered bones follow the map of ancient herds. In some caves we find wear patterns that suggest seasonal use. Neanderthals were not nomadic in the chaotic sense. They were patterned. They returned to the same places when the herds returned. They understood cycles. They built memory into the land. It is possible they even altered it, creating drive lanes or traps using fallen trees, natural gullies, and stone. Though nothing permanent remains, the intelligence to see landscape not as background but as opportunity is unmistakable, and the landscape saw them too. Predators, after all, are part of the ecosystem. They influence prey behaviour, herd movement, even vegetation patterns by limiting overgrazing. In this way, Neanderthals became ecological participants, not just takers, but shapers. Every hunt was a negotiation with the land and the creatures upon it. But unlike lions or wolves, Neanderthals knew what it meant to remember a loss, to carry grief, to bury the dead. Which raises a final question. What was the emotional toll of this life? When a hunt succeeded, the group ate, laughed, and endured. But when it failed, when a hunter didn't return, when blood on the snow belonged not to bison but to brother, what then? They must have remembered. The way the forest sounded before the charge, the last glance exchanged, the echo of breath in the cold, and then, once again, they picked up the spear. Because for Neanderthals, the hunt was not just about feeding the body, it was about sustaining the group, about honouring the risk, the ritual, and the repetition that held their world together. Every successful strike was a continuation of memory, a fulfillment of knowledge passed down through gesture and grit. Every meal shared around the fire was a quiet affirmation that survival was still possible. And yet it wasn't just brute survival. There was grace in it, a kind of rough elegance in the way they read the wind, the way they moved in silence, the way they shaped stone to mirror the arc of a shoulder, the thrust of a wrist. Their tools were not ornamental, but they were beautiful in purpose, edges sharp, forms balanced, their weight honed to the rhythm of the hunt. There is a profound humility in acknowledging that these ancient people, so often cast as primitive or brutal, operated with a level of ecological and social intelligence we are only beginning to understand. They did not kill to conquer, they killed to continue, and in doing so they mirrored the great predators of the natural world, while also exceeding them, with foresight, with planning, with care for the wounded and the old. Because Neanderthals did something else too. They taught the young. How else could this knowledge persist for so long, across so many generations and landscapes? A child would have watched from the shadows of a rock face, seen the angle of the spear, the placement of the feet, the moment when motion turned to strike. They would have listened, memorized, mimicked. They would have learned not just how to kill, but when, and why. This is the quiet legacy of the hunt. Not trophies, not dominance, but transmission. The passing down of a worldview in which every meal was earned, every life taken was weighed, and every success was collective. And when we walk through the fossilized plains of Ice Age Europe, through the ravines and caves where bones lie bleached and silent, we are walking through their battlegrounds and their classrooms. The Neanderthals left no great monuments, no cities, no statues, but they left this, scars of survival, proof of courage, traces of discipline and daring carved into the ice and into the bone. We often define intelligence by invention, by what is built, what is written. But perhaps it is time we broaden that lens. To orchestrate a hunt against a mammoth with nothing but stone, fire and unity, that is intelligence. To trust others enough to stake your life beside theirs, that is culture. To carry the wounded home, to share the meat, to bury the fallen, that is something more. In the frozen world, the Neanderthals were predators, but they were also poets of the practical, masters of movement, bearers of knowledge that we still carry dimly in the instincts of our breath, our gatherings, our hunger. And in every shared meal, something ancient returns. Long before the walls of the first cities rose, long before the invention of bricks or beams, there were hands, chapped, cracked, weathered, driving sharpened stakes into frozen soil. There were hides stretched tight over bone, wind whistling through stitched seams and firelight flickering against earthen walls. Shelter for the Neanderthals was never an architecture of permanence. It was a gesture of resilience, a decision again and again to stay, to endure, to belong, even when the cold howled like a predator just beyond the skin of the world. How did Neanderthals survive the Ice Age? Not just how they hunted, or what they wore, but how they stayed still long enough to rest, to raise children, to imagine a tomorrow. In the glacial winds of Europe's Middle Paleolithic, shelter was the quiet art of defiance, and it began with intention. Across the archaeological record, scattered like brittle constellations in the darkness of prehistory, are signs that these early humans didn't merely huddle in caves as passive refugees from the cold. They built. Stake holes, arrayed in subtle but deliberate circles, mark the footprint of temporary dwellings, perhaps dome-shaped huts made of mammoth bones and sinew, lashed with branches and cloaked in animal skins. At Moldova in Ukraine, in the sediment near the Dniester River, lies one such ghost, a structure more than 40,000 years old, ringed with bones, its purpose clear despite the erosion of centuries. It was a windbreaker, a wall, a place for warmth to hold. How many hands stitched its seams? How many nights did it withstand before it collapsed beneath snow or rot? We cannot know, but we can imagine the labour, the choice of site, the sinking of poles, the gathering of hides, the smell of smoke clinging to damp fur, the hum of breath in a sealed space. In that construction is the root of something vital, not survival alone, but foresight. What must it have felt like to build against the wind? To feel the temperature fall and answer not with flight but with form? Shelter was not an accident. It was architecture born of memory, passed between generations, refined with each storm. It speaks to the adaptability of a species shaped by glacial pressure, but also to something else, something quieter, a sense of place. Because to build is to stay. Even temporarily, it is an act of rootedness, of belief in a next day worth facing. It marks a rhythm in the Neanderthal world, a cycle of return, of landscape familiarity. These people were not wandering blindly across the Ice Age map. They knew where the rivers froze slowest, where the caves held light longest, where the bison grazed in early spring. What happens when shelter becomes more than protection? When it becomes memory? When a structure, however fragile, marks the point on the earth where a child laughed, or a meal was shared, or someone took their last breath. Perhaps that is the true foundation, laid not in soil but in story. And like story, Neanderthal shelters were shaped by rhythm. The rhythm of season, of prey movement, of memory encoded in landscape. This was not permanence in the modern sense, these were not towns or settlements, but it was repetition, a kind of nomadic fidelity. They returned to the same places year after year, generation after generation, not because they were trapped, but because they were attuned. Each site offered something particular, a strategic view of the steppe, a rock overhang facing away from the prevailing wind, a valley that gathered warmth like a cupped hand. Mobility, then, was not randomness. It was resonance. Neanderthals practiced a form of seasonal choreography, moving across familiar terrain with purpose, in tune with cycles older than language. They likely knew which animals would be grazing near a river bend in spring, or when berries would appear along the forest edge in late summer. And as they moved, they carried not just tools and hides, but the knowledge of where to pause, where to build, where the wind didn't bite as sharply. In those pauses they stitched lives together. Archaeological traces of this rhythm linger in the soil, at sites like La Ferracie in France. Multiple Neanderthal individuals were buried over time in the same cave. Their remains weren't haphazardly scattered, they were placed deliberately as if the cave had become a repository of memory. A place they returned to not just for shelter, but for continuity, for ceremony. It's tempting to see caves as crude refuges, mere accidents of geography. But in the hands of Neanderthals, caves became homes. Long-term occupation left marks, hearths layered over centuries, stone tools clustered near fire pits, debris from meals swept into corners. The caves were dark, yes, but they were not empty. They were lived in, shaped by habit and intention. Smoke marks on ceilings show where fires burned consistently in the same spots. Sometimes, deep within, walls were blackened high above reach, indicating that fires were deliberately built to heat larger chambers or to push light further into the darkness. This isn't desperation, it's engineering, a mastery of airflow, insulation, and resource allocation. And perhaps most telling are the bones, those of animals brought in, butchered, and shared. The mix suggests not just what was available, but what was chosen. Reindeer for meat and hide, foxes maybe for fur, hares, even birds, each one a piece in the puzzle of persistence. But it wasn't just about keeping the body alive. It was about creating a space where life could unfold in something like rhythm, where elders could teach, where children could play in firelight, where the group could exhale for a moment, no longer prey. In a world of endless motion, building shelter, however impermanent, was an act of orientation. A way to say here, for now, we belong. Those two words, unspoken but lived, were the essence of every windbreak, every stitched hide, every circle of mammoth bone set upright in frozen soil. Shelter was not only a refuge from the cold, it was a marker of community. It said, this is where we gather, where we eat, where we wait for the storms to pass. Even if the walls were thin and the roof low, the act of making it was a statement of intent. It was a gesture toward continuity in a landscape of impermanence. Archaeologists now recognise a surprising range of Neanderthal shelters. Some were no more than overhangs cleverly blocked with stone slabs and skins to divert the wind. Others, like those discovered at Moldova on the Dniester River, show elaborate arrangements of mammoth bones forming circular or oval structures, the earliest known houses in Europe. Within these rings, hearths smouldered, stone tools lay scattered, and piles of animal bones told of meals prepared and shared. These weren't crude improvisations. They were planned, they were built, and yet they were always temporary. These dwellings weren't meant to last years. They were seasonal homes, erected where the herds passed or the fishing was good, dismantled or abandoned when the group moved on. In this way, Neanderthals lived in a tension between motion and stillness, mobile, but never rootless. The map of their lives was drawn not by walls but by memory. A cave here, a sheltered ridge there, a river crossing where the ice broke last. Each location a chapter in a cycle of return. The caves, too, reflect this pattern. They weren't only emergency shelters stumbled into during storms. Many show evidence of long-term occupation, multiple hearths, layers of ash, stone napping debris, even signs of sleeping areas. Some, like Lafarassi and Shanidar, became places of burial as well as life. These weren't merely shelters from the elements. They were spaces of continuity, where life and death coexisted, where generations could literally live atop the remains of those who came before. This sense of familiarity with the land, of belonging to it rather than conquering it, was itself a survival strategy. Knowing where the best flint lay exposed, where water remained unfrozen, where wind patterns shifted with the seasons, these were forms of knowledge as vital as any spear point. And that knowledge wasn't held by one individual. It was communal, distributed across the group like a living map. Shelter, then, was more than architecture. It was a memory device, a pause in the movement of bodies where the movement of ideas could happen. Teaching, planning, even perhaps imagining. Every stake driven into frozen ground was a line drawn across time, anchoring a people not just to a place, but to each other. And this raises a deeper question. If building was a way of belonging, did it also become a way of thinking? To build is to anticipate, to imagine a structure before it exists, to choose a site not just for the now, but for the coming hours, days, or perhaps moons. That mental leap, from present discomfort to future safety, is a profound cognitive act, and for Neanderthals, it was a necessary one. Every shelter they constructed reflected not just physical necessity, but a forecast of weather, of danger, of need. This anticipatory thinking is evident in how they chose and modified their environments. Wind-blocking walls, whether made of stone, bone, or brush, weren't randomly placed. They were oriented, often facing away from prevailing winds, taking advantage of natural landforms to enhance their efficiency. Entrances were narrowed or partially sealed with skins or stacked materials to reduce drafts, and hearths were positioned to optimize heat retention. These are not just survival hacks, they are deliberate choices, refined over generations. In this, we see a kind of ancestral architecture, not monumental, not permanent, but intimate and exacting. It wasn't about imposing structure on the land, but adapting to its rhythms. Caves were not hollow voids to be filled, they were canvases. Overhangs were extended with walls, floors were levelled, fire pits carved, smoke patterns managed, and where caves weren't available, Neanderthals made their own enclosures, layered ecosystems of warmth, light, and function in the middle of a frozen world. And they weren't passive dwellers in these spaces. Their shelters were animated by life, food prepared and shared, stories perhaps murmured in the flicker of flame, children playing in the circle of warmth. The very bones of their prey became walls. The hides of animals they tracked for days became doors and blankets. In their shelters, life and death cohabited, raw materials transformed by need, memory stitched into every surface. And yet, these structures never outlived the people who built them. They decayed, they blew away. They collapsed beneath snow or were reclaimed by the earth. All that remains now are post holes in soil, a scatter of burned bone, a subtle discoloration in the cave floor. But these fragments whisper of lives once lived in intimate proximity to nature and to one another. They remind us that shelter isn't about walls. It's about intention, about the will to persist. There is a quiet philosophy embedded in this way of living. It tells us that permanence was never the goal, only continuity, that staying alive required not domination, but observation, a sensitivity to change, a willingness to leave and return, a relationship to the land not as property but as partner. And in this way, each shelter, brief though it may have been, became a promise, not just of safety, but of return, of belonging again and again, to the same rhythms of wind and fire, of stone and skin. It is here in this ancient balance that we glimpse a kind of wisdom, because the Neanderthals' shelters, fragile as they weren't only acts of engineering, they were acts of care. Each one was an answer to a question asked by the wind: will you endure? And each time the answer was yes. Yes, we will stop here. Yes, we will hold the cold at bay. Yes, we will make a space for life to unfold, even if just for a season. This was more than survival. It was belonging made physical. It was a form of reciprocity with the land. By learning where to build, how to build, and when to leave, the Neanderthals didn't just inhabit the Ice Age, they participated in it. Their shelters mark them not as conquerors, but as collaborators with a vast, changeable environment. They left no monuments behind, but their traces are still visible to us precisely because they built in rhythm with the world rather than against it. In caves where hearths once burned for decades, archaeologists find soot layers stacked like pages of a book. Each layer records a chapter of life, a winter spent here, a summer hunt there, a burial in the corner of a chamber that had become sacred through use. These are not random smudges of ash. They are time itself sedimented into walls and floors, telling us how long people returned to these same places, how deeply these places were woven into their identity. And so the caves were more than emergency shelters. They were homes. They were repositories of memory, spaces where generations might live and die under the same dark ceiling, teaching their children where to find warmth and how to make it. The seasonal dwellings built outside on open plains or riverbanks were extensions of this practice, temporary hearts of community beating in rhythm with the migration of herds and the turning of seasons. To imagine a Neanderthal shelter is to imagine more than poles and hides. It is to imagine a grandmother tightening seams against the wind, a child waking to the scent of smoke, a father returning from a hunt and ducking through the entrance to a space transformed by human hands into something gentler than the world outside. Inside, firelight flickers across faces, illuminating not just survival, but kinship, not just warmth, but presence. And when the group moved on, the shelter fell back into the land, but the knowledge, the choice of site, the stitching of hide, the memory of wind direction travelled with them. In this way, their homes were never lost. They were carried forward, alive in the minds and hands of those who built the next one. This is the quiet legacy of Neanderthal shelter. Not permanence, but persistence. Not architecture, but intimacy. Not walls that stand for millennia, but gestures that endure in us. The impulse to gather, to build, to shield each other from the elements. Even now, in our cities of stone and glass, we echo that ancient act. We still build against the wind, and in doing so, we still say, here, for now. We belong. They weren't chased. They weren't cornered. They weren't wiped away by some single cataclysm or contagion. If there was a fall, it was slower than myth allows, quieter than extinction implies. But there was a change, vast and irreversible, and it began when strangers appeared, visitors from the south, another kind of human, crossing thresholds of desert and sea. And for the first time in 100,000 winters, Neanderthals were no longer alone. Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, entered Europe not with fanfare or war drums, but like wind through pine trees. They had already wandered the Middle East, dipped their hands in the coasts of Arabia, watched the sun rise over African highlands. They came from heat into cold, from savannah into snow, from familiarity into the unknown. What must it have felt like to step into the breathing mouth of a glacial forest and know there were others, not beasts, not gods, but people, already living here? This was not first contact in the way modern imaginations crave. There were no formal greetings, no summit of tribes. What happened instead was smaller, stranger, more human. Tracks in the mud, smoke curling from a distant ridge, a broken tool in a riverbed that did not match the hands that held it. What happens to the self when it encounters its mirror? By the time Homo sapiens reached Europe, Neanderthals had already spent 300,000 years becoming of the land. thick-boned, cold-forged, quiet masters of the Pleistocene. But the newcomers were different, more graceful, more numerous, carrying objects not easily explained, beads, ochre, blades more delicate than what had come before. Where Neanderthals had endured, sapiens adapted. They were no better, no wiser, just different, and sometimes different is enough. The genetic record is not a scroll, but a palimpsest. It shows that these two humans did not only meet, they touched. And from that contact came entanglement. In caves across Europe, Vindija in Croatia, Peștera Oase in Romania, and Grotta du Rhin in France, we find ancient remains that do not fit cleanly into categories. Bones shaped like Neanderthals, but with traits unfamiliar. Teeth from one, DNA from both. What do you call a person who comes from two worlds? It would be easier, perhaps, if the record were clearer, but clarity is a luxury of the present, and the past resists simplicity. Instead, we have fragments, a child's jaw, a woman's thumb, genetic markers that whisper of shared ancestry. Roughly 2% of your own DNA, if you are of non-African descent, still belongs to them. The Neanderthals are not gone. They are hidden inside us, not ghosts, but inheritance. How do you mourn someone who became your ancestor? The Ice Age was a theatre of thresholds, between firelight and dark, between survival and memory, between self and other. And when Homo sapiens crossed into that ancient domain, it was not a conquest, it was a question. Two humans, both shaped by ice and hunger and hope, now stood face to face. What would they see? What would they share? In the soil of southwestern France, in a limestone shelter called Grotta du Rhin, archaeologists unearthed ornaments, pendants made of animal teeth, bone awls, ochre-stained tools. At first glance, these seemed unmistakably sapiens, symbolic objects, markers of abstract thought. But nearby, in the same sediment layers, lay Neanderthal remains. Not just tools beside bones, but ideas beside identities. Were Neanderthals mimicking sapiens? Or had they already begun to change, to innovate, even before the strangers arrived? These questions matter because they ask us to reconsider what contact means. It wasn't just gene flow, the biological fusion of populations. It was cultural friction, cognitive exchange, the sharing of techniques, languages, perhaps even myths. The archaeological record becomes a conversation, held across time. Did they learn to pierce shells together? Did they sit at the same hearth, sharpening blades under starlight? Did a Neanderthal child trace the spiral of a painted symbol and ask what it meant? Europe was never empty. The landscapes we now associate with cathedrals, highways and vineyards once held a different kind of sacred. The invisible territories of memory that humans mapped in the snow. And in those territories, the meeting of Neanderthal and sapiens was not a single moment, but a slow entanglement. There were likely years, decades, centuries of cautious overlap. Separate camps on either side of a valley, occasional crossings, accidents, alliances, births that blurred the line. Modern genetics gives us timelines, but not emotions. We know interbreeding occurred, not once, but many times. In southern Europe, it may have happened as early as 60,000 years ago. In the Denisova cave in Siberia, the child of a Neanderthal mother and Denisovan father was buried in the cold. And across Eurasia, traces of sapiens DNA turn up in ancient Neanderthal genomes, proving that the exchange flowed both ways. These were not one-sided encounters. They were messy, mutual, and deeply human. But it wasn't just reproduction, it was risk. To touch a stranger is to gamble with identity. To share shelter is to open the self to difference. Imagine a young Neanderthal and a young sapien sitting near the same fire, not knowing the words the other spoke, only gestures, the tone of voice, the shape of laughter. Imagine the awkwardness, the curiosity, the slow realization, you are not me. And yet, somehow, you are. What followed from these encounters remains debated. Did Neanderthals adopt new hunting strategies? Did sapiens learn cold weather skills from their hosts? Perhaps ideas didn't need to be taught, only witnessed. The presence of another human, one who carved stone a little differently, who painted lines across their skin, who danced or sang, may have been enough to spark change. Not revolution, but subtle evolution, a widening of possibility. This was not the beginning of the end, not yet. But it was the beginning of something else: hybridity, complexity, ambiguity. The neat boundaries of species and culture began to blur. And in that blur, something profoundly human was taking shape. Not just in the mingling of genes, but in the shared recognition of mortality, memory and meaning. If Neanderthals and Homo sapiens met beneath the cold sky and built something, even fleeting, between them, then it wasn't just biology that passed from one to the other, it was empathy, it was story. In northern Spain, the caves of El Castillo hold some of the oldest known cave art in the world. Red discs painted on stone, handprints left behind like whispers. For a long time we assumed these were made by sapiens, a sign of their symbolic mind. But new dating techniques tell another story. Some of these artworks may predate the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe, which means the hands may have been Neanderthal. What if the Neanderthals had always been storytellers in their own way? What if the contact with sapiens didn't awaken culture in them, but merely revealed what had long been there? Ritual, memory, the will to mark time and space. The appearance of others didn't make them human. It may have shown us that they already were. Even in our own DNA, the echoes of this encounter persist. The gene known as EPAS1, which helps modern Tibetans survive at high altitudes, likely came from Denisovans. Some Neanderthal variants influence our immune responses, our skin tone, even our sleep cycles. Others increase risk for depression or nicotine addiction. We don't carry their memories, but we carry their influences, ghostly instructions riding inside our cells. To say they're gone is not entirely true. They live on, but differently than we expected. Not in stories passed down through language, but in mitochondria and muscle. Not in monuments, but in molecular shadows. Our bodies are part fossil, part future. And the past too is complicated by this inheritance. For centuries, we cast Neanderthals as brutish, slow, doomed to extinction the moment something brighter appeared. But that idea says more about us than about them. It reveals our need for a single victor, for a linear path. But history doesn't care for neatness. Evolution isn't a contest, and survival isn't always a reward for being smarter or stronger. Sometimes it's just the result of wind, chance, and where the herds chose to roam. Still, one question lingers like a footprint half filled with snow. When they met us, did they know what was coming? Could a Neanderthal sense, in the eyes of a sapiens, the shape of things to come, the shifting balance, the slow erasure? Or maybe they didn't feel threatened. Maybe they felt seen. Maybe they saw the sapiens not as invaders, but as relatives. Distant cousins returning from a long journey, kin who spoke a slightly different dialect of existence. After all, both had walked through the same ice. Both had looked into fire and dreamed. Both had buried their dead, cared for the injured, and whispered songs into darkness. In the quiet before the change, perhaps there was a moment of shared stillness. Two kinds of human, side by side, listening to the wind. In that wind was the future, not yet spoken, but already on the way. Because after contact came consequence. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the balance began to shift. Homo sapiens were not better suited to survival in any singular way, but their numbers grew faster. Their networks stretched wider. Their culture, expressed through shared symbols, ornaments, and long-distance trade, expanded like mycelium through the forest floor, quietly weaving a web of resilience. Neanderthals, by contrast, remained localized. Family bands, small and tight-knit, loyal to known valleys and ancient trails. They had survived hundreds of thousands of years by knowing the land, not by conquering it. But now, the land was changing. Not just the landscape, though climate oscillations continued to shift forests into tundra and rivers into dust, but the human landscape too. Where once they were alone, now they were part of a crowd. Some genetic models suggest Neanderthal populations were already declining before the arrival of sapiens. Bottlenecks, isolation, low diversity, a species under stress. Contact with Homo sapiens didn't create those problems, but it complicated them. Hybrid children, uncertain alliances, overlapping hunting grounds. In the long arithmetic of survival, even small pressures can compound. And yet, extinction is the wrong word. What happened to the Neanderthals was not a dramatic vanishing, but a slow fading. In site after site, from the Iberian Peninsula to the Caucasus Mountains, we see the Neanderthals retreat, not with violence, not with fire, but with absence. Layers of ash no longer appear, tool types change, DNA signatures vanish, but not entirely. In Gibraltar, at Gorham's Cave, evidence suggests Neanderthals survived long after they disappeared from the rest of Europe, maybe even into the time of pyramids and early agriculture, clinging to a final coastline, watching the sun sink into the sea. What does it mean to endure, but not forever? And what does it mean that they live on in us, not just in blood, but in breath, in the shape of our rib cages, in how we sleep, in the way our brains process anxiety? Some of your immune system's strengths and vulnerabilities may come from them. They're part of the architecture of what we now call modern humanity. But more than that, they remind us that modern is not a virtue. It is not a badge of superiority. It is a condition of timing. If the Ice Age had never thawed, if the mammoths had remained, if the forest paths had led slightly differently, we might be the vanished ones, and they the ones telling stories by screenlight. Instead, we carry them as memory without memory, unconscious passengers in our genome, reflections in bone. We name them other, but the border is thinner than we admit. We met them, we touched them, and in some quiet way, we became them. And so this chapter of human history ends not with a war, but with a whisper, one people becoming another, one kind of breath merging with another's silence. It is easy, perhaps too easy, to imagine the Neanderthals' end as tragic, a quiet tragedy of replacement, displacement, and erasure. And in some ways, it was. They disappeared, not because they were weak or inferior, but because the world around them shifted, and they could not shift fast enough. Climate, contact, and complexity, each exerted pressure, each demanded adaptation. And sometimes, even the best survivors fall short of the future. But extinction is not failure. In the long narrative of life on Earth, every species ends. What matters is not the end, but the shape of the time they had. And the Neanderthals, their time was extraordinary. For over 300,000 years, they endured some of the most brutal environments our planet has ever known. They hunted creatures 10 times their size. They built homes, made tools, shared food, cared for their injured, and honoured their dead. They mastered fire, adapted to ice, and explored meaning. And when others appeared, strange faces, strange voices, they did not fight blindly. They met them. They touched them, they folded into something new, and so we return, full circle, to the mystery beneath the title, How Neanderthals Survived the Ice Age, until they didn't. The answer is both vast and intimate. They survived because they were brilliantly adapted, because they were social, inventive, and enduring, because they understood cold and dark, and how to hold on to life when breath turned to frost. And they didn't survive, because even brilliance has limits, because history is not a meritocracy, because the future is never guaranteed, not for mammoths, not for Neanderthals, not even for us. But perhaps survival isn't the only measure. Perhaps memory is its own kind of persistence, and in that sense they are still here. In our DNA, yes, the molecular remnants of ancient unions, but also in our imagination. In the shadows of caves, in the curve of a handprint, in the ways we still wonder who we are and where we came from. The strangers who appeared never truly left, because the strangers were us, and we are them, bound not just by blood, but by the shared silence of deep time. So if you ever find yourself standing on a cold hillside, the wind pulling at your coat, try to picture the ones who came before, not as fossils but as people, not as lost but as present, in your bones, your breath, your story. And remember, long before we named ourselves modern, we met others who were already human, and from that meeting came not only the future, but the memory of the past. The next time you exhale into winter air and see your breath vanish into the sky, know that it carries 1,000 generations before you, Neanderthal, sapiens, and everything in between, all of it drifting, briefly visible before disappearing into the cold. Two kinds of human beings stared into the same fire and saw themselves reflected in its flickering light. For a fleeting moment in the long dusk of prehistory, the Earth was home not to one intelligent species, but to two. Neanderthals forged in ice and silence, and Homo sapiens, shaped by sun and movement, now occupied the same breath of time. This was not merely a crossing of paths, it was a convergence of minds. And it posed a question that still lingers in our museums, in our bones and in our dreams. When these two kinds of human met, who changed whom? It begins with a mystery. In southern France and northern Spain, archaeologists have unearthed artifacts so delicate, so intentionally adorned. They seem to belong not to Neanderthals but to the so-called moderns. Necklaces strung with animal teeth, eagle talons shaped into pendants, pigment-stained shells arranged with care, evidence not of survival but of beauty. And yet these objects, associated with what is called the Châtelperronian culture, emerge from layers of sediment that date not to the reign of Homo sapiens, but to a time when Neanderthals still walked alone. Could it be that the Neanderthals made them? Could it be that the Neanderthals, long dismissed as brutes, had a symbolic life, one with meaning, memory and art? If so, then the border between us and them begins to dissolve. The Châtelperronian culture is like a half-whispered song, heard at the edge of a frozen forest. It appears abruptly around 45,000 years ago, existing for only a blink in archaeological time, but in that blink it leaves behind clues that challenge everything we thought we knew about the Neanderthal mind. Their tools, once thought to be crude and unchanging, suddenly bear refinement. Blade-like forms, curved bone awls, ivory ornaments. Were these objects copied from sapiens? Were they trade goods, absorbed without understanding? Or were they the flowering of something already stirring beneath the surface, a native creativity long hidden beneath layers of assumption? What does it mean to adorn the body in a world of snow and shadow? What does it mean to choose colour when survival demands only warmth? Red ochre, black manganese, yellow clays. These were not the marks of utility. They were marks of identity, of ceremony, of presence. Some Neanderthal sites show repeated pigment use near burial grounds. Some hint at feather collection, not for bedding but for display. Others reveal incised bones, marked with patterns that seem too deliberate to be mere butchery. If meaning lives in the margins, then the margins of Neanderthal life were alive with meaning. We must ask, did they see themselves as we see ourselves? Did they mark the body because they grasped the concept of selfhood? The idea that a being can be both physical and symbolic, both flesh and story? Or did they learn this from us? Or we from them? Perhaps it was not a mirror that stood between the two species. Perhaps it was a window, and each side was peering in. Through that window we glimpse a world where culture flows in two directions at once. Archaeologists no longer speak with certainty about who invented what. Instead, they describe contact zones, places where Neanderthals and Homo sapiens overlapped, leaving behind blended toolkits, shared pigments, and hybrid traditions. The Châtelperronian sites are just one example of this blurring. Their tools echo the sophistication of Upper Paleolithic sapiens, yet their makers appear unmistakably to be Neanderthals. What does this mean for our story of human uniqueness? For generations we placed ourselves at the pinnacle of a cognitive hierarchy, inventors of art, symbol, and abstraction. The Neanderthals were supposed to be strong but unimaginative, capable hunters but not storytellers. Yet at these contact zones, the evidence refuses to cooperate. Strings of pierced shells, talons carved and polished, pigments carefully prepared. These are not the gestures of a mind trapped in instinct. These are choices, deliberate and sustained. These are signs of a mind aware of itself. Some scholars argue that these objects prove Neanderthals borrowed from sapiens. Others counter that they were already capable of symbolic thought, and that contact merely accelerated a process already underway. Perhaps the truth lies between a kind of cultural symbiosis in which the presence of another intelligent species spurred each to new forms of expression. Just as a songbird may change its call when a rival appears nearby, perhaps the Neanderthal imagination sharpened in the echo of another voice. Even the pigments tell a story of intention. Red ochre, found at Neanderthal sites, was sometimes heated to alter its hue, a process requiring foresight and experimentation. Manganese dioxide blocks, long thought to be used as colouring agents, now show signs they may have been ground to make fire-starting powders. This is not rote behaviour, it is innovation. It is a willingness to experiment with material, to repurpose it, to see beyond the obvious, and then there are the feathers. At sites across Iberia, Neanderthal bones are found alongside bird remains, with wings deliberately cut to extract feathers. Not for bedding, not for insulation, but for adornment. To wear a feather is to transform the body, to signal something unseen, rank, kinship, ritual, beauty. These gestures speak a language we cannot translate, but we can feel its rhythm. We can sense its depth. In the flickering light of these finds, the old picture of Neanderthals as silent, unadorned, and unthinking fades. What replaces it is stranger and more beautiful, another kind of human, reflecting us back to ourselves, showing us that intelligence does not arrive in a single shape, but in many. And in that realization, a question forms like frost on glass. If they could imagine, if they could symbolize, if they could adorn, then what truly separated them from us? Maybe nothing, maybe everything, or maybe just time. For centuries we drew that line between the imaginative and the instinctual, the symbolic and the brute, and placed ourselves firmly on one side of it. But with each new Neanderthal find, the line moves, it dissolves, it loops back. What if that boundary was never so firm to begin with? What if we've been asking the wrong question all along? Instead of were they like us? We might ask. Why did we assume they weren't? The idea of symbolic thinking has long been the final gatekeeper of what we call modern behaviour. It is the realm of metaphor, of abstraction, of imagining something that does not physically exist. A god, a memory, a future. The presence of ornaments and pigments in Neanderthal sites suggests not only an appreciation for aesthetics, but something deeper. The ability to assign meaning. A bead is not food. A red handprint on a cave wall is not shelter. And yet these things matter. They are gestures that declare, I was here. They are echoes of self, and that is what makes them dangerous, to our assumptions. Because if Neanderthals could think symbolically, then the history of consciousness is not ours alone. It is shared, it is older, it is wider. Recent discoveries have only deepened this mystery. In caves like La Pasiega and Maltravieso in Spain, red-painted shapes, ladders, dots, stenciled handprints have been dated to over 64,000 years ago. This is at least 20,000 years before Homo sapiens arrived in Europe. If the dating holds, it means these paintings were not made by us. They were Neanderthal creations, and they were not utilitarian. They were symbolic. They were art. It's a quiet revolution in thinking, and it humbles us, because we've spent so long measuring others by our own standards, by what we believe makes us exceptional. But perhaps what makes us truly human is not uniqueness, but connection. Perhaps the defining trait of humanity is not the creation of art, but the recognition of it in others. When we look at a Neanderthal pigment kit, or a carved bone, or a string of perforated shells, we are not simply cataloguing artifacts. We are encountering another consciousness, one that looked at the world and then tried to represent it, one that made things not just to use, but to mean. It changes the story, not just of Neanderthals, but of us. Because if they had the capacity for symbolic thought, then so many other lines begin to blur. Language, for example, which has long been debated in relation to our ancient cousins. If you can mark meaning in pigment and bone, can you not also shape it with sound? The mirror grows deeper, and in it, we see not a reflection of superiority, but of kinship. This kinship is not sentimental. It is archaeological, genetic, cultural. It is layered in the soil beneath our feet, in the DNA braided quietly into our cells. Across much of the world today, the average human carries between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA, a trace that speaks not of annihilation, but of encounter. It speaks of nights by shared fires, of exchanged glances, of whispered words we will never recover. In Europe and parts of Asia, the Neanderthal presence did not vanish. It was absorbed, transformed, remembered in bodies. This biological legacy deepens the cultural one. If we carry their blood, why should we not carry their memory? And if we share memory, then perhaps we also share the capacity to wonder, to see a feather not just as an object, but as an offering, to press pigment to skin or stone, and in that act, express something beyond survival. It reframes the archaeological record. No longer do we see Neanderthal sites as quiet or static. They become animated, places where minds met, where innovations were exchanged not through conquest but through proximity. In southern France and northern Iberia, Châtelperronian layers appear like ghosts between the deeper Mousterian and the more recent Aurignacian. These are not abrupt displacements, they are intertwinings. They suggest a moment, perhaps brief, perhaps profound, when two species lived not at war, but at the edge of one another's worlds. And at that edge, imitation and inspiration danced together. Was a Neanderthal child the first in their lineage to pierce a shell and string it around their neck after seeing a Homo sapiens child do the same? Or was it the other way around? Did a sapiens wander into a Neanderthal camp and notice the ochre smeared on a face, or the feathers woven through hair? Culture, after all, is not bound by genetics. It flows like firelight from one mind to the next. The very idea of invention begins to shift. Perhaps some of the earlier symbolic behaviours in Homo sapiens were not created in isolation, but co-inspired through this contact. Just as ecosystems grow richer through diversity, maybe the collision of two intelligent species catalyse new forms of thought. In this view, the symbolic turn, that long arc toward meaning, wasn't a single leap by a chosen people. It was a shared journey through darkness, where sparks passed from hand to hand. And it was fragile, because as quickly as this moment appeared, it began to fade. The Châtelperronian horizon vanishes from the record after just a few thousand years. The Neanderthal presence, once widespread, deeply rooted, begins to thin, and soon only one kind of human remains. But in their absence, they left something behind, not only in our bones but in our imaginations, a whisper that tells us you were never alone, and perhaps even now, we aren't, not fully. The legacy of Neanderthals lives in more than our DNA. It lingers in our deepest impulses, in the way we decorate, in the need to belong, in the quiet yearning to be seen and remembered. These are not modern traits. They are ancient ones, woven into the minds of creatures who once upon a time knelt beside a hearth, ground pigment to dust and pressed red hands to stone. That handprint, simple and silent, may be the most profound of all their messages. It is not a symbol of power or utility or even beauty. It is a declaration of being. I existed. I saw. I left something behind. And in its stark clarity, it speaks across tens of thousands of years to us, the descendants of a future they could never have imagined. We may never know if Neanderthals sang or prayed or danced under stars, but we know they marked, they adorned, they chose, and that is enough to suggest a mind capable of wonder. In the vast sweep of prehistory, it is easy to reduce the past to patterns, tools, bones, migrations. But culture leaves quieter footprints. It lives in colour smeared on cave walls, in the angle of a bead worn thin by use, in the stubborn endurance of a feather tied with care. These fragments do not shout, they murmur. But what they say is unmistakable. They say that intelligence wore many faces, that meaning was made in more than one way, that the story of humanity was always plural, and as we gaze back through time, through sediment and smoke and pigment, we are not looking at some failed prototype. We are looking into a mirror, cracked perhaps, but still reflecting. And the image it gives back is not of something lost, but something shared. For a time, we walked beside them, not just in forests and valleys, but in thought, in craft, in imagination. And now, in remembering them, we do more than honour the past. We inherit its questions. Because the story of symbolic thought, of culture, art, language, it does not begin with us. It begins in the spaces between species, in the flicker of contact, in the silent exchange of ideas. And in that exchange, we are changed. The mirror in the dark remains, not to show us our dominance, but to remind us of our kin. The ones who lived, who imagined, and who left behind traces that still, even now, ignite wonder. And so we listen, not for answers, but for echoes. For nearly 300,000 years, Neanderthals endured the Ice Age's bitter lessons, sculpting survival from snow, silence, and stone. And then, the Earth shifted. Not metaphorically, but quite literally. Massive currents in the North Atlantic stalled, glaciers cracked and surged, ecosystems fractured, and a world these people had learned to read like breath on glass became illegible once more. This chapter is not about what Neanderthals did wrong, it's about what the Earth did next. It begins not in fire, but in meltwater, in what scientists now call Heinrich events, catastrophic climatic spasms, vast armadas of icebergs carved off from crumbling ice sheets and drifted south into the Atlantic. Each time this happened, the ocean's conveyor belts faltered, salinity plummeted, rainfall patterns shifted. Within mere centuries, sometimes within decades, the landscapes of Ice Age Europe became unrecognizable. Forests shriveled, steppe grasslands collapsed, and with them the mighty herds, mammoths, bison, reindeer. They vanished from entire regions, as if fleeing a silent predator. What happens when the foundation of a culture is pulled out from beneath its feet? For Neanderthals, hunting was more than subsistence. It was architecture. Their tools, their group sizes, even the rhythms of their seasonal movements were tethered to the availability of prey. The climate didn't just bring cold, it brought absence. Absence of food, absence of certainty, absence of the familiar. How does a people who have survived everything adapt to a world that no longer obeys its own rules? Archaeologists trace the trail not in words but in silence. The silence of abandoned sites, the silence of fewer tools, the silence of scattered bones where there once were hearths. Once thriving valleys now yield sparse evidence of occupation. A cave that held generations may now hold only a handful of flakes. Across Europe, the signature of Neanderthal presence begins to fade. Not all at once, but like breath evaporating from a mirror. And yet this was not extinction. Not yet. In pockets, they endured. In mountain redoubts, in wind-lashed coastlines, in hard-to-reach refugia carved by terrain and time, Neanderthals persisted. But these were not the great interconnected bands of old. They were fragmented, isolated, small. And with isolation comes something quieter than hunger. It brings the slow erosion of identity. When you cannot meet your neighbours, cannot exchange mates or stories or new techniques, how long before the fire burns lower? The genetic record speaks with eerie clarity. Around 50,000 years ago, Neanderthal populations had already begun to decline, not just in size but in diversity. Their genome narrows, like a river splitting into smaller and smaller tributaries, struggling to reach the sea. Bottlenecks, inbreeding, genetic load. These are not abstract terms. They are signs of people living on the edge, with fewer hands, fewer choices, and fewer paths forward. What happens when survival becomes endurance without renewal? You survive, but smaller. You remember, but less. The once rich web of interactions that knit Neanderthals across a continent frays into threadbare strands. A group here, another 200 miles away, each adapting alone. Some cling to familiar hunting grounds, others follow the reindeer deeper into the cold. But in all cases, one thread is unmistakable: disconnection. What had once been a species with regional styles, shared tool traditions, and genetic exchange had become a patchwork of isolated pockets, each one quieter, each one more vulnerable. This is not simply a tale of climate getting worse. In fact, the cruel irony is that the cold itself may not have been the deadliest part. Neanderthals had adapted to cold for hundreds of thousands of years. What proved more perilous was volatility. Change too fast, too irregular, too disorienting. Between 60,000 and 40,000 years ago, Europe saw an unprecedented burst of climatic instability. Temperatures could rise or fall by 10 degrees Celsius in less than a century, within a few lifetimes. Rainfall patterns shifted, rivers dried or flooded, entire ecosystems morphed, vanished or emerged. It wasn't just surviving cold, it was surviving confusion. Imagine being born into a world your parents understood, only to find, as you come of age, that none of their knowledge maps cleanly onto the land around you. The game no longer follows the same migration paths. The plants no longer grow in the same places. The shelters once carved into hillsides no longer stand against new winds. This is what Neanderthals faced. A world that not only turned against them, but betrayed their hard-won wisdom. And still, they adapted, or tried. In some places, we find signs of shifting strategies, hunting smaller, more agile animals like ibex and deer. In others, there's evidence of increased use of coastal resources like shellfish or seal. But these were coping strategies, necessary, intelligent, yet reactive, and survival, when reduced to reaction, leaves little energy for culture, for art, for innovation. This is where the archaeological silence deepens. The rich regional variation of earlier Mousterian tools becomes less distinct. The complexity of composite tools dwindles. Symbolic behaviours so carefully kindled in earlier millennia become harder to detect. We cannot know whether this represents a cultural contraction or simply a shift in what survives. But the trend is clear. Something changed. Demographic modelling supports the same picture. Small, dispersed groups face higher risks of extinction, not just from external forces, but from internal fragility. A winter too harsh, a few deaths in key hunters, a loss of elders, and with them, knowledge. The fewer you are, the more each loss echoes, and perhaps most hauntingly, these shrinking populations would have known they were not alone. Across valleys once theirs, footprints began to appear that weren't made by their kind. Homo sapiens, newly arrived, highly mobile and thriving in greater numbers, moved into the same landscapes. Where once Neanderthals had hunted without competition, they now shared the chase. And while the newcomers may not have outcompeted them immediately or violently, their presence was a pressure of a different kind, a background hum of encroachment, a reminder that history had introduced a rival rhythm. Climate was not acting alone. It had cracked open the land, and through those cracks other forces seeped in. Competition, displacement, subtle shifts in who had access to key resources. In the fossil record, we find signs of overlapping occupations. Neanderthal hearths in deeper layers, modern human ones just above. There's no sign of war, no clash of civilizations, but absence tells its own story. Neanderthals disappear from some regions just as Homo sapiens arrive. The transition is quiet, but it is complete. In France, in Spain, in parts of Central Europe, Neanderthals begin to vanish from the record in this window, not all at once, but like candles snuffed one by one in the dark. We don't find signs of mass death. We find signs of absence, emptied landscapes, fewer tools, bones scattered alone instead of in groups. This was not extinction by catastrophe. It was attrition, collapse not as an event, but as a slow yielding. And that might be the most difficult thing to grasp from the outside. The way deep time doesn't always dramatize its losses. The Earth didn't punish Neanderthals, it simply turned, and they were caught in its wake. Meanwhile, Homo sapiens, more numerous, more connected, and arguably more flexible in adapting their social structures, filled in the spaces left behind. In places where Neanderthals might have once traded mates across long distances, modern humans now moved freely. Where one culture faded, another expanded, bringing new materials, new tools, new styles of expression. And in their genome, even now, traces of Neanderthals whisper from within, evidence that not all encounters were hostile, some were intimate. But the blood that carried Neanderthal legacy forward did so in a different body. By the time the cold relented and forests began to return to parts of Europe, Neanderthals were already gone from most of the continent. Not vanished in fire or war, but worn down by the weight of climate and time and solitude. The harshest blow was not the ice, it was the isolation. Because survival isn't just about staying alive, it's about connection, memory, continuity. And in that, Neanderthals faced their most insidious foe, fragmentation. Even now, in the silence of prehistoric bones, we can read the consequences. Genetic data tells us that by 50,000 years ago, well before the final disappearance, Neanderthal populations were already small and highly inbred. In one individual found in the Altai Mountains, researchers uncovered a genome that suggested his parents were either close relatives or the offspring of generations of isolation. The warning is clear. This wasn't a thriving network of resilient groups. It was a dwindling chorus, voices fading one by one, and yet there's a kind of dignity in the record. These weren't people who gave up. In fragmented bands, they continued to hunt, build shelters, make fire, and even care for their sick. At Shanidar in Iraq, one Neanderthal with severe disabilities was not only kept alive, he was looked after, fed, and protected for years. That happened long before their end, but it reminds us who they were. Even in isolation they nurtured care, but care can't always outrun collapse. fragmentation affects more than genetics, it touches culture. In isolated groups, innovations may arise, but they struggle to spread. A tool improvement, a new way of tanning hides, or a symbolic ritual may flower in one valley, and then die with the group that invented it. There is no transmission without connection, no resilience without relationship. The Earth itself didn't stop changing. Another Heinrich event swept across the northern hemisphere. Forests retreated again, arid plains surged. Across Central and Western Europe, the ice pressed southward, reshaping entire ecosystems. Herds moved, water vanished, and with them went the lifelines Neanderthals had relied upon for millennia. This isn't simply an environmental story, it's an existential one. When your world changes faster than your culture can adapt, what does that do to memory? To language? To the unspoken teachings passed from elder to child? How much of what made a Neanderthal life coherent, its rituals, seasons, senses of place, was stripped away, replaced by constant adaptation? This is a theme we return to often in deep history, the cost of losing rhythm. Because human cultures from our earliest days weren't just about survival, they were about pattern, the way we mark the return of birds, the flowering of herbs, the passage of herds through mountain passes. When those patterns fracture, something else dies with them, not just knowledge, but orientation, the feeling that the world has a logic, a cadence, a place for you. So when we ask why Neanderthals vanished, it may be tempting to look for a single cinematic cause, a battle, a famine, a plague. But in truth, the story is slower, sadder, and more human. Disconnection, disorientation, and the long, slow unravelling of familiarity. By around 40,000 years ago, only a few pockets of Neanderthals remained. The Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain and Portugal, appears to have been among their final refuges, shielded somewhat by mountains and distance, a place where the glacial winds softened just enough to hold on. And for a time, they did. In caves like Gorham's on the Rock of Gibraltar, their signs linger. Tools, hearths, traces of hunting, even a curious engraving, lines etched into stone, perhaps a symbol, perhaps a memory, a last voice, speaking in a language now lost. But in the end, the retreat became silence. Their disappearance wasn't marked by any catastrophe the Earth remembers in fire or ash. No comet, no explosion. Just the last flicker of campfire in a cave, a final footprint in the loam. The soft crumble of a roofless shelter. One by one, the stars blinked out. And yet, they are not entirely gone. They persist in fragments of our DNA, a small percentage in nearly every person of non-African descent, a whisper of shared ancestry, a molecular memory. But more than that, they remain in the questions we still ask, about what it means to survive, about the limits of endurance, about how much connection matters in the face of chaos, because the world that betrayed them is not gone. Climate still breaks, ecosystems still collapse, and isolation, cultural, ecological, emotional, remains one of our greatest vulnerabilities. The Neanderthal story is not just prehistoric, it's prophetic. They teach us that intelligence alone isn't enough, that to survive great change, you need more than tools and fire, you need relationship. Movement, exchange, the weaving together of stories and skills across space and time, and that perhaps, in the end, they didn't lose to us. Not in a contest, not in a war, but to something more indifferent, a climate that shattered the paths between them, a silence too wide to cross, a disintegration that no individual could reverse alone. When the Earth changed, they endured as long as they could, and that's the truth at the heart of their disappearance. They didn't fail, they endured until the world asked too much. We, the inheritors of both their DNA and their dreams, now face a world just as unstable. The question is not whether we're smarter, it's whether we've learned. A child lights a fire at the mouth of a cave, unaware it may be one of the last. The wind howls across the rocky threshold of Gorham's cave in what we now call Gibraltar, salt-laced from the sea and bitter with the cold of the late Pleistocene. Behind her, in the shadows, others sit close, closer now than ever before. Not for warmth, but because something has changed. There are fewer of them, fewer voices, fewer footprints, fewer eyes to witness the fading of a world. And yet the child does not know that she is the end of a lineage. She does not know that her kind, broad-shouldered and thick-browed, once roamed from the Atlantic coasts to the steppes of Siberia. She does not know that in the mountain caves of the Caucasus and along the crags of the Iberian Peninsula, her people now exist only in pockets, like fading embers waiting for one last gust of wind. To her, the world is still a story worth telling around a fire, still a pattern of seasons and hunts and shadows and warmth. And perhaps that's all survival ever truly meant. But to us, looking backward, her fire is not just a flame, it is a final signal. Because by the time we find these ashes, tens of thousands of years will have passed. The sediment will thicken, the cave will partially collapse, the air will warm, the coastlines will shift. And Homo sapiens, us, will wander across the thresholds where Neanderthals once built their fires, unaware of the silence they've inherited. What does it mean to vanish slowly? The archaeological record is cruel in its subtlety. There is no singular extinction event, no thunderous collapse, no mass grave or frozen battlefield. Only the gradual thinning of clues, fewer stone tools, fewer hearths, fewer worked bones. Like the trailing footprints of someone walking backward into fog, Neanderthals disappear not with drama, but with erosion. And that may be the most tragic ending of all, the one no one recognises in real time. In sites like El Salt in Spain, layers of occupation grow sparse before vanishing altogether. In the Caucasus, once rich campsites go quiet, and in the caves of Gibraltar, some of the last holdouts known to science, signs of occupation flicker into the deep past. Mousterian tools left scattered like forgotten prayers, charcoal from long-dead flames. A presence that once was, and then was not. Did they know? Did they feel the spaces growing emptier, the hunts yielding less meat, the children born with fewer cousins? Did elders speak of times when the world was fuller? Or did it all feel normal, gradual, explainable, until it didn't? Because extinction is not always a cliff. Sometimes it is a slope, barely noticed until the ground is gone. And as that slope steepened, something else began to erode. Not just numbers, but complexity. In these final refuges, we start to see signs of strain not only in bones and tools, but in the fabric of Neanderthal culture itself. The rhythms that once carried them through centuries, the crafting of flint blades, the shaping of shelters, the care of kin, begin to falter. The artifacts speak less clearly. Tools lose their refinement. Variety narrows. The symbolic expression seen in earlier times in pigments and personal adornment begins to vanish. Not completely, but enough to raise a quiet question. What happens when a people become too few? This isn't failure, it's fragmentation. Populations isolated in mountain valleys or coastal caves were cut off not just from resources, but from each other. In the Pleistocene world, connection was strength. Information flowed from group to group. Techniques were passed along river corridors and shared over campfires. But as climate shifted and ranges collapsed, those pathways closed. A tool innovation made in the East might never reach the West. A survival strategy honed by one group may have died with them, unknown to others who needed it. In a way, Neanderthals weren't just losing land. They were losing themselves, piece by piece, from the edges inward. And the genetic record tells a story of narrowing too. In the bones of late Neanderthals, scientists have found signs of inbreeding, unmistakable markers that once distinct groups were collapsing inward, intermarrying not by choice but necessity. In a study of a family from El Sidron Cave, researchers found siblings, uncles and nieces interwoven in unexpected ways. The gene pool was shallow, the options limited, and with that inbreeding came genetic drift, the random loss of diversity that, over time, can diminish the resilience of a population. Immunity, fertility, adaptability, all suffer when variation fades. This is not the story of a species losing intelligence, or strength, or dignity. It is the story of a species losing room to breathe. In the smaller groups, vulnerability increased. A single harsh winter might take half a band. A hunting injury might end not one life, but a lineage. And the more they dwindled, the more likely each remaining fire was the only one for miles. For the first time in hundreds of thousands of years, a Neanderthal might go an entire season, perhaps a lifetime, without seeing another unfamiliar face. They had become ghosts to one another before they became ghosts to us, and yet, still, they endured. Somehow they kept lighting fires. Somehow they kept crafting stone and hunting prey. Somehow they kept raising children beneath the cold limestone ceilings of Europe. They must have loved. They must have grieved. They must have told stories that no one now remembers, because the end for them wasn't an event. It was a way of life slipping quietly into stillness. In the caves of Gorham's and Vanguard, high above the Mediterranean tides at the southern tip of Iberia, that stillness became nearly absolute. These stone chambers were not just shelter, they were sanctuary. Archaeologists have found repeated layers of occupation here, sedimented over thousands of years, flint tools chipped and sharpened, bones of ibex and red deer carefully butchered, even fire residues pressed into the soil. These caves were lived in, returned to, remembered. But what we do not find in these later layers speaks as loudly as what we do. The toolkit simplifies. The once vivid trade in exotic materials dwindles. The artistry fades. The rhythms slow. It's not a collapse. It's a retreat into habit. What was once a chorus of innovation becomes a whisper of survival, a fire lit not to create but simply to continue. And in the distant east, near the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains, another story unfolds in parallel. In places like Mesmaïskaya Cave in Russia, we find signs of Neanderthal children buried with care, their bones nestled among ochre-stained earth. But here too, their presence ends. One season they are here, and the next they are not. No mass grave, no disaster layer, just absence. This is perhaps the most haunting part of their story, the quietness of the vanishing. Extinction in our minds often feels loud, sudden, violent. But the end of the Neanderthals is more like fog thinning at dawn, a slow unmaking, unmarked by any final battle or dramatic cataclysm. There is something profoundly human in that, because we too fade this way. Cultures dissolve not in flames but in silences. Languages are lost not through conquest, but through forgetfulness. The things that once gave shape to a people, songs, shelters, names, can disappear in the pause between generations. So it was for them. There was no one moment when the last Neanderthal knew they were the last. No solemn ceremony, no farewell. Just the continuation of days, slightly lonelier than before. It is this absence that lingers, in the archaeological record, in the landscape, in us. When researchers look at those final layers in Gibraltar or the Caucasus, they are looking not just for bones or tools, they are listening for echoes. What did it sound like the last time a Neanderthal child laughed in a cave? What were the last words spoken in a language now extinct? What memories were folded into those final fires, their smoke curling up towards stone ceilings no longer lit by torches? There are no answers, only evidence, only silence. And yet, in that silence, something remains. Not the Neanderthals themselves, but the space they left behind, the outline of a people drawn in negative. We know they were here by what is no longer here. Their absence, paradoxically, makes their presence more poignant, like a hollow in the snow where someone once sat. Their story did not end with a bang. It ended with a breath, a pause, a last ember glowing in the dark. That ember may have flickered for centuries in isolation. In these final refugia, the last Neanderthal groups lived not as mythic recluses, but as families, as people, trading old knowledge, preparing meat, maintaining fire. But the walls began to close, slowly, invisibly. Glacial cycles reshaped their world. Vegetation patterns shifted, prey animals migrated elsewhere, and the seasons grew harsher, less predictable. The coastlines that had once welcomed warmth now breathed chill. What was once familiarity became estrangement. Isolation deepened, not just geographically, but genetically. We begin to see signs in their DNA, echoes of the narrowing. High levels of homozygosity in these final individuals suggest communities so small, so insular, that their gene pools folded in upon themselves, cousin upon cousin, generation after generation, with little influx from beyond. The randomness of mutation and the scarcity of mates created what evolutionary biologists call genetic drift, a slow, unconscious unravelling of biological diversity. It didn't mean they were weak, it meant they were cornered. Inbreeding alone does not destroy a population, but over time it limits resilience. It leaves fewer tools in the genetic toolbox. When disease strikes, or when resources thin, adaptability suffers. And in the complex ecological theatre of Ice Age Europe, adaptability was survival. Meanwhile, the world around them didn't pause. Homo sapiens, humans like us, were expanding, flexing. Their populations grew. They filled landscapes once shared. They crossed rivers and mountains and forests, bringing not war but noise, trade, competition, shadow. The Neanderthals, whose story had played out across hundreds of thousands of years, now found themselves not alone but outnumbered. And as their communities shrank, so did their culture. We see fewer signs of innovation in these final chapters. The complex flake tools of earlier Mousterian industries give way to cruder implements. Ornamentation disappears, artistic expressions, the pigments, the notched bones, fade from view. There are fewer children buried with care, fewer hearths, fewer signs of choice. This is not collapse. It is withering. Culture, after all, is breath shared between people. It needs company. Memory needs others to hear it. And when communities become too small, culture becomes harder to carry. Not because people forget, but because there is no one left to remember. Imagine a group of 15 individuals living year after year, travelling the same well-worn paths along cliffside and stream. The old ones teach the young, but when the old die, the story narrows. A single death takes with it a library. And slowly, over years, knowledge evaporates like dew. The archaeological record does not capture this. It captures what was left behind, not what was never passed on. It is in this vanishing, this soft and aching erosion, that the final Neanderthals slipped from history's grasp. Yet even in their dwindling, they endured. They lit fires, they hunted, they lived. For tens of thousands of years after our kind arrived in Europe, they remained, not defeated, simply diminishing. And it is here, in the echo of those last lives, that the true beauty of their resilience is revealed. There is something profoundly human in the way they remained. Not by triumph, not by conquest, but by staying, by persisting, by waking up each day, gathering wood, mending tools, watching the movements of animals across the tundra, and whispering stories by the firelight, even if no one would one day write them down. They did not know they were the last. No one ever does. In Gorham's Cave, Gibraltar, the winds still howl through limestone openings shaped by time and tide. For decades, archaeologists believed these caves were empty of meaning. But then, under layers of sediment, they found hearths, charcoal remains of meals long turned to ash, footprints etched into soft clay, cut bones, even etchings, cross-hatched marks scratched into the rock wall, a sign, a symbol, a gesture toward memory. We do not know if these were the last Neanderthals, but we know they were among them. Living on the edge of a continent, looking out at the Atlantic, they watched the suns sink beyond the sea, never knowing they would be the final chapter of their kind. In the Caucasus, in a cave called Mesmaiskaya, the skeleton of a small child was found buried with care, curled gently into the earth. The DNA told a story of hardship, a closed gene pool, a life lived in scarcity, and yet someone who loved her, dug the grave, placed her in it, touched her hair, stayed a moment in silence before walking away. This is the kind of ending prehistory gives us, not a moment of collapse but a dimming, a hush, a tapering off into stillness. Not a bang but a whisper. By 38,000 years ago their traces begin to vanish, not all at once, not everywhere, but unmistakably. Cave layers once thick with tools and fire ash go bare, bones cease appearing, DNA stops resurfacing in sediment cores, and slowly the earth forgets the shape of their passing, but not entirely, because even now they are not gone. Their legacy lives inside us, in our genes, yes, but also in our questions, in our capacity to imagine their lives, in the warmth we feel for those who came before, and in the hush that falls when we hear that phrase, the last of them. We may not know their names, but we remember their silence. And perhaps that is how they live on, not in dominance or victory or myth, but in the reverent quiet that follows the end of a long story told well. Because to survive is one kind of triumph, but to be remembered, not as a fossil, not as a footnote but as kin, is another entirely. And maybe that is what remains, a fire that no longer burns, but whose warmth still reaches us, across ice, across stone, across the deep, dark span of time. There is something profoundly human in the way they remained, not by triumph, not by conquest, but by staying, by persisting, by waking up each day, gathering wood, mending tools, watching the movements of animals across the tundra, and whispering stories by the firelight, even if no one would one day write them down. They did not know they were the last. No one ever does. In Gorham's Cave, Gibraltar, the winds still howl through limestone openings shaped by time and tide. For decades, archaeologists believed these caves were empty of meaning. But then, under layers of sediment, they found hearths, charcoal remains of meals long turned to ash, footprints etched into soft clay, cut bones, even etchings, cross-hatched marks scratched into the rock wall. A sign? A symbol? A gesture toward memory? We do not know if these were the last Neanderthals, but we know they were among them. Living on the edge of a continent, looking out at the Atlantic, they watched the sun sink beyond the sea, never knowing they would be the final chapter of their kind. In the Caucasus, in a cave called Mesmeskaya, the skeleton of a small child was found buried with care, curled gently into the earth. The DNA told a story of hardship, a closed gene pool, a life lived in scarcity, and yet someone who loved her, dug the grave, placed her in it, touched her hair, stayed a moment in silence before walking away. This is the kind of ending prehistory gives us, not a moment of collapse but a dimming, a hush, a tapering off into stillness, not a bang but a whisper. By 38,000 years ago, their traces begin to vanish, not all at once, not everywhere, but unmistakably. Cave layers once thick with tools and fire ash go bare, bones cease appearing, DNA stops resurfacing in sediment cores, and slowly the Earth forgets the shape of their passing. But not entirely, because even now they are not gone. Their legacy lives inside us, in our genes, yes, but also in our questions, in our capacity to imagine their lives, in the warmth we feel for those who came before, and in the hush that falls when we hear that phrase, the last of them. We may not know their names, but we remember their silence. And perhaps that is how they live on, not in dominance or victory or myth, but in the reverent quiet that follows the end of a long story told well. Because to survive is one kind of triumph, but to be remembered, not as a fossil, not as a footnote, but as kin, is another entirely, and maybe that is what remains, a fire that no longer burns, but whose warmth still reaches us, across ice, across stone, across the deep, dark span of time. The fires died, but the story did not. Neanderthals left no monuments, no cathedrals, no songs written on stone, and yet they live on, not as echoes, but as breath. In your blood, in your marrow, in the barely spoken language of your cells they whisper. They are not gone. Because extinction in the human story is never absolute, it is porous. It leaves stains and threads and fingerprints, and in the mirror of your own biology they are still there, watching. What does it mean to vanish, but not be lost? The last Neanderthal vanished over 38,000 years ago, and yet today fragments of them walk the earth. A curl of DNA that resists viruses, a gene that shapes how the skin responds to sun, a strand that shifts the architecture of sleep or deepens the swell of inflammation after a wound. These are not fossils, they are alive, they are you. Modern genetic research, meticulous, slow, impossibly delicate, began to unravel this paradox only in the last few decades. When scientists sequenced the Neanderthal genome in 2010, something astonishing emerged. Nearly every person outside of Africa carries between 1 to 2% of Neanderthal DNA. That percentage might seem small, a statistical murmur, barely worth a headline, but in evolutionary terms, it is thunder. How does a vanished people continue to sculpt the living? The answer is intimate and often invisible. Neanderthal genes are not preserved evenly across the body. Some have been welcomed, others rejected. They appear in the immune system, in the machinery that defends us from ancient pathogens still lurking in the world. They tangle in the keratin of our skin and hair, in the way we sweat, in how we process fat. They ghost the edges of behaviour too. Correlations, not causes, have been drawn between Neanderthal alleles and shifts in circadian rhythm, depression, nicotine addiction, even risk-taking. None of these traits are destiny, but they are inheritance. Traces of a life that did not end, only dispersed. Is this how legacy works? Not as memory, but mutation. One of the most striking revelations of this genetic mosaic is its asymmetry. While all non-African populations carry Neanderthal DNA, the specific fragments vary. In some East Asian groups, the proportion is slightly higher. In Europeans, certain genes influencing skin tone and immune response persist more prominently. This suggests multiple waves of interbreeding, multiple crossings, multiple moments when Homo sapiens and Neanderthals met not as enemies but as kin, however briefly. And in these minglings, something extraordinary occurred. Not conquest, not erasure, but absorption. The body as archive, the genome as palimpsest. A record not of dominance but of entanglement. What happens when extinction is not a clean break but a braid? There is no face of a Neanderthal on your family tree, but in your bones they resonate. A pain sensitivity, a clotting pattern, a way of metabolizing starch or tolerating cold. These are whispers, not shouts, but they persist long after the voice has faded. It is here, in this quiet persistence, that the paradox of Neanderthal extinction unfolds. They are gone, and yet they remain. When you look at the branching tree of human evolution, Neanderthals appear as a thick, sturdy branch splitting from Homo heidelbergensis roughly 400,000 years ago. For hundreds of millennia, they were the dominant human presence in Europe and Western Asia. Then their branch seems to end, a sharp, clean break on the diagram. But in reality, that branch does not stop. It curls inward, grafting itself to another. What appears as an ending is, in fact, an infusion. This graft is not metaphorical, it's molecular. When Homo sapiens left Africa roughly 60,000 years ago, they entered Neanderthal lands. There, over thousands of years, contact wasn't occasional, but continual. Some groups likely traded or exchanged techniques, others interbred. These unions weren't rare exceptions. They were part of the fabric of interaction. And though Neanderthals would disappear as a distinct people, their genes were already carried forward, woven into the bodies of those who would one day call themselves modern. In your skin you can still see their shadows. Variants inherited from Neanderthals influence pigmentation and keratin production. These adaptations may once have helped early Homo sapiens survive in colder, darker climates, just as Neanderthals had. In your immune system, their presence is even clearer. Several Neanderthal-derived genes govern how we respond to viruses and bacteria, shaping inflammation, fever, and recovery. Some of these genes are double-edged swords, protective against ancient plagues, yet correlated today with autoimmune conditions like lupus or allergies. Their survival advantage was forged for another age, another ecology, another set of challenges. Even your inner clock may whisper Neanderthal. Studies suggest that alleles linked to circadian rhythm and sleep patterns came from our ancient cousins. In a world of harsh winters and long, dim days, these variations may have been vital. Now, in electric nights and shifting time zones, they can manifest as insomnia, early rising, or seasonal mood changes. The past still tugs at our sleep. The deeper researchers look, the more they see Neanderthal traces shaping the smallest, most intimate corners of human life. Not just in outward features or immunology, but in complex traits, clotting factors, fat metabolism, perhaps even how our brains respond to stress. None of this makes us Neanderthals. It makes us the descendants of entanglement. And that is the paradox at the heart of this chapter. The Neanderthals vanished, but their legacy has not. They survive through us, not as fossils, but as functions. Extinction here is not the opposite of survival. It is survival transformed. When the last fire in the caves went out, the story did not end. It changed narrators. Because the Neanderthals are not behind us. They are within us, in ways both measurable and mysterious. And this inheritance, this biological echo, is more than a genetic footnote. It challenges the way we define extinction and even how we draw the boundaries of species. For much of the 20th century, Neanderthals were painted as evolutionary cul-de-sacs. Our failed cousins frozen in time. They were cast as less intelligent, less social, less human. But their DNA, now flowing in billions of people, refuses that narrative. If extinction means total erasure, Neanderthals defy it. This invites a deeper question. Where does one species end and another begin? In school books, we often draw clear lines. Homo sapiens here, Neanderthals there. But biology is not so tidy. Interbreeding blurs the lines. Shared behaviours, like burying the dead, using pigments or crafting tools, smudge the boundaries further. Genomics now reveals that some populations of modern humans carry up to 2% Neanderthal DNA. That may seem small, but it means the influence is global. It means that extinction, in this case, was not a vanishing, but a merging. Still, even with this merging, something was lost. Their languages, if they had them, are gone. Their music, if they sang, is silent. The stories they may have told around firelight do not echo. Their art, if it existed, has rarely survived. What remains are bones and genomes, stone tools and hearthstains, and the traits carried quietly in our cells. We can reconstruct so much, but we cannot resurrect them whole, and yet the legacy lives on in form and function. One particularly evocative example lies in the modern immune response to pathogens. Certain Neanderthal genes related to toll-like receptors, proteins involved in detecting microbial invaders, are still active in us today. These genes were likely beneficial in Ice Age Europe and Asia, where unfamiliar bacteria and viruses posed constant threats. When Homo sapiens arrived from Africa, these Neanderthal adaptations helped them survive the microbial minefield of new territories. Without them, some lineages may have faltered. Elsewhere, the influence lies in our skin and hair. Genes involved in keratin, a protein crucial for structure, may have shaped the texture and strength of hair and the toughness of skin in colder environments. The traits we sometimes think of as ethnic or regional, thicker body hair, light or ruddy skin, a tendency towards sun sensitivity or cold resilience, can be in part Neanderthal in origin. It's not just legacy, it's identity. But perhaps the most profound inheritance is neither functional nor visible. It is the knowledge that humans are not solitary in their success. We carry within us the memory of a people who walked through fire, hunted mammoth, and endured the cold, and then, quietly, became part of us. They may not have cities, but they have descendants. This is the paradox we inherit. Neanderthals are both gone and alive, absent and present, extinct yet surviving in the quiet architecture of our bodies. It complicates the way we think about legacy. Most species leave fossils, tracks, impressions in stone. Neanderthals left something more intimate, themselves embedded in us. In every breath, every heartbeat, their endurance lives on, folded invisibly into what it means to be human. But what exactly did they give us? Not gifts, in the sense of intention, but inheritances shaped by the circumstances of survival. Among the clearest of these inheritances are genes that regulate our immune systems. Modern research shows that Neanderthal-derived alleles increase our ability to recognize pathogens, a survival tool in a world dense with microbes. These same genes, however, may also predispose us to autoimmune conditions. What once was a defense against ancient disease can, in the modern world, misfire. Their resilience is still echoing, but in a new environment it sometimes turns against us. Other fragments speak of adaptation to the physical world. Genes affecting hemoglobin may alter how we carry oxygen through our blood, fine-tuning our responses to cold or high altitudes. Genes that influence fat metabolism shape how our bodies store and use energy. These traits would have been crucial for Neanderthals living in glacial Europe, where calories were precious and winters unrelenting. Today, they may help explain variations in how different populations process diet, exercise, and even vulnerability to conditions like diabetes. And then there are the inheritances that touch behavior. Studies hint that certain Neanderthal alleles affect circadian rhythms, shifting the balance between early risers and night owls. In Ice Age environments where daylight was scarce, these shifts may have been adaptive, but in the modern world, under artificial light, the echoes can emerge as insomnia. mood changes, or sensitivity to seasonal cycles. Even in our restlessness, we may be carrying their shadow. Each of these fragments paints a picture not of dominance but of entanglement. We did not replace the Neanderthals so much as absorb them. Their disappearance was not a clean break, but a diffusion. Our genomes are mosaics, patchworks of encounters written into code. That makes extinction less absolute, less final. It blurs the line between us and them until the boundary begins to dissolve. And in that blurring, we find something hauntingly beautiful. Neanderthals are not just a story of what was lost. They are a story of what continues. They live in the way we fight disease, in the way we digest food, in the way we sleep beneath the waxing and waning of light. They live not in ruins, but in blood. And perhaps that is why their absence is so haunting. They are gone, and yet we feel them close, not behind us, but within us. A people both vanished and enduring. A paradox written in our flesh. And so, the Neanderthals endure not as ghosts on the edge of history, but as companions carried forward in us. Their extinction, when seen through this lens, is not an erasure but a transformation. They are gone as a people, yes. Their voices no longer echo through limestone caves, their tools no longer strike sparks in the dark, but their survival continues in every cell of those who descend from the ancient crossings of bloodlines. We do not walk alone, we never did. This reframes the way we tell their story. Extinction is usually imagined as absence, as silence, as loss. And yet, with Neanderthals, it is also presence. A presence diffused into us, shaping the way we respond to sunlight, to hunger, to disease, even to sadness. Their inheritance is not dramatic. It is subtle. It lingers in the quiet machinery of life. It reminds us that survival is not always about standing apart. Sometimes it is about joining, merging, becoming part of something larger than oneself. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson their story carries. Survival is plural. Neanderthals did not survive by continuing as they were. They survived by becoming part of us. They disappeared as a people but endured as a lineage. Extinction here is not the opposite of life. It is a different kind of continuity. And this is why their absence feels so uncanny. When we think of Neanderthals, we imagine them gone, standing apart in a frozen world that no longer exists. But when we look in the mirror or trace the patterns of our genes, we find them close, almost intimate. The truth is that they are not behind glass in a museum. They are here, inside the living. You carry them when you breathe, when you bleed, when you dream. That truth softens the tragedy of their vanishing. The last fires of Gibraltar, the last voices in the Caucasus, the last children born in caves no longer warmed by neighbours. These moments mark the end of Neanderthals as a separate people. But the story did not end there. The flame leapt across bodies, across unions, across generations, until it landed here, in us. We are not just the descendants of Homo sapiens. We are the descendants of humanity plural, of encounters, of mingling, of entanglement. So when we say the Neanderthals are extinct, we speak only a partial truth. They are extinct as a culture, as a community, as a visible presence upon the earth. But they are not extinct in the ways that matter most. They live on, not only in bones and genomes, but in the living systems that carry their legacy forward. The fires of their caves are long cold, but the warmth remains, in blood and bone, in rhythm and memory. They vanished, but they are not lost. They are here, in us, forever. For 400,000 years, Neanderthals endured. They hunted mammoth on frozen plains, built fires in stone shelters, and raised children beneath the weight of glaciers. They changed as the earth changed, bending their bodies and their cultures to a world of ice and storm. And still, they vanished. The central question their story leaves us is not whether they survived. They did, again and again, but whether survival itself was ever enough, or whether every triumph against nature was always destined to be temporary. What does it mean, after all, to survive for so long only to disappear? Perhaps the first truth is that survival is never permanent. Every species, no matter how adapted, exists on borrowed time. The Earth rewrites its rules with each turn of its climate cycles. Forests rise and fall. Rivers carve new paths. Glaciers advance like armies and then retreat, leaving the land remade. In this vast choreography, Neanderthals were not failures, but participants. They endured longer than we have yet existed. 400,000 years is not a collapse, it is an epic, and yet it ends in silence. When we frame their story as tragedy, we make ourselves the victors by contrast. Homo sapiens, still here, still multiplying, become the inevitable winners. But was it truly inevitable? Or is that simply the myth we tell ourselves? For most of their existence, Neanderthals had no rivals. They faced lions and leopards, woolly rhinos and the cold, but they endured. When Homo sapiens finally entered their world, it was not destiny that sealed Neanderthal fate. It was contingency. It was chance. What if survival depended not on strength or intelligence alone, but on circumstance? Consider the smallness of numbers. Archaeology suggests Neanderthal populations were never vast. They lived in scattered bands, isolated by geography, connected only loosely by shared culture. A drought here, a storm there, a sudden sickness in a family group, and the thread of continuity could snap. Homo sapiens, in contrast, expanded from a larger population base, spreading outward with greater density. Was it really superiority, or simply momentum? If we measure survival by tools, Neanderthals stand alongside us. They crafted stone flakes with precision, shaped birch tar into glue and controlled fire. If we measure it by social life, they cared for the injured, buried their dead, and likely spoke in tongues of meaning we will never fully recover. They were not deficient. They were human in all but name. So why did survival falter? The truth may be that survival requires more than adaptation. It requires memory, the ability to transmit lessons across generations. It requires cooperation, the weaving together of communities that can endure beyond the loss of any one family. And it requires something we rarely acknowledge: luck, a storm that strikes in one valley rather than another, a child who lives rather than dies, a chance encounter that brings new blood, new ideas, new possibilities. Without luck, even the strongest falter. And in the long run of Neanderthal history, luck may have been the rarest resource of all. Their world was stitched together by fragile threads, kinship lines, hunting ranges, glacial corridors that opened and closed like lungs. When those threads frayed, the cost was more than isolation. It was cultural silence, memory lost, songs unspoken, a tool unlearned. Extinction, in this view, wasn't an event. It was an erosion, slow, partial, relentless. Some archaeologists now speak of cultural drift in late Neanderthal populations, a thinning of complexity, a narrowing of variation. Not a collapse, but a quieting. Tools became simpler. Ornamentation disappeared. The signals of symbolic behaviour, once debated in Neanderthal contexts, grow faint. But this too may be misleading. It's easy to mistake absence for decline. A missing artifact may simply be a missing record. After all, history doesn't vanish evenly. The winds of time carry some stories farther than others, but even in the fragments, we begin to reframe the narrative. Perhaps survival wasn't always about progress. Perhaps it was about continuity, holding on through disruption, not innovating endlessly, but preserving enough to begin again. In this light, the Neanderthal legacy isn't just a failed path. It is a mirror, showing us the fragility of all that we consider permanent. Civilizations rise, but they do not promise endurance. Adaptation is not victory. It is only alignment, for a time. And here perhaps is the deepest truth. The myth of Homo sapiens as inevitable victors is not just wrong. It is dangerous. It blinds us to the role of contingency, and it casts survival as a story of merit, as if the Earth chose us because we were better. But the archaeological record tells another story, of near misses, population bottlenecks, migrations halted by deserts or drowned by sea. There were moments when Homo sapiens too almost vanished. We didn't persist because we were chosen. We persisted because the dice rolled in our favour. For now, this does not diminish the achievements of our ancestors. It only humbles them. Creativity, memory, ritual. These were shared human traits, not ours alone. Neanderthals buried their dead with flowers, mixed pigments for adornment, likely spoke with nuance and intention. In their homes, the firelight flickered over eyes that dreamed and hands that remembered. When we see ourselves as their successors rather than their descendants, we sever a lineage that was never truly broken, because in our blood the story continues. Genes we carry today, for immune responses, for skin and hair, perhaps even for neurological sensitivity, bear traces of Neanderthal inheritance. They did not survive only in memory or myth. They survived biologically, inscribed in the double helix of modern populations. This is not metaphor, it is molecular history, the past written into the flesh. And yet, even with this legacy, the question lingers. If survival alone was never enough, what is? What meaning do we assign to endurance, if all roads eventually lead to silence? Perhaps survival is not measured in centuries, but in what is carried and what is changed along the way. In this, the Neanderthals offer us a difficult but necessary reflection. They endured for nearly 500,000 years, longer than our own species has yet walked the earth. Their tools evolved, their minds expanded. They crossed frozen plains and raised children in the shadow of glaciers. They survived by adapting, not dominating. But in the end, endurance proved insufficient, not because they lacked intelligence, not because they failed to innovate, but because the world changed faster than they could reweave their thread into its shifting fabric. When prey vanished, when forests turned to tundra or sea, when familiar landscapes betrayed their memory, there were no guarantees. Evolution is not a reward system, it is a response mechanism, and the climate did not pause to negotiate. Even so, they were not passive. They adapted in ways that defy our assumptions. They communicated complex plans to bring down massive prey. They constructed shelters from mammoth bones and branches. They created adhesives from birch pitch through a controlled, oxygen-limited process, a form of early chemistry. They watched, learned, adjusted. They endured, and yet their extinction still came, not because they failed, but because the world is indifferent to triumph. Species rise not only by merit but by margin. A winter a little harsher, a disease a little deadlier, a resource a little scarcer. Survival is not a badge of superiority, but an intersection of redness and chance. A narrow pass through a mountain of pressures. Neanderthals walked that pass longer than most. So why do we so often cast them as a cautionary tale, rather than as ancestors in full? Perhaps because to see their end clearly is to confront our own contingency. We want to believe we are the culmination, the climax. But we are not the final chapter, we are a moment, like them. And if we forget this, if we see ourselves only as victors, not as inheritors, we risk losing the humility their story invites. Because what the Neanderthals teach us, if we listen closely, is that survival alone is not a narrative, it is a condition. The real story lies in what we build within that condition, how we shape meaning, how we share knowledge, how we remember those who came before. For Neanderthals, that legacy was lived in the quiet endurance of generations, passed not through monuments, but through action, memory and blood. And in this way they survived, not endlessly, but deeply, not forever, but enough to leave echoes. In us, those echoes continue, sometimes as a gene, sometimes as a tool, sometimes as a flicker of empathy when we imagine them at the fire's edge. That empathy may be the most human inheritance of all. And so we return to the question, is endurance enough, or is it only the setting for something else, something more lasting than life itself? To understand this, we must step outside the narrow frame of winners and losers, of extinct and surviving, and instead look at the deep continuum that binds all branches of the human tree. In this continuum, Neanderthals were not a failed experiment. They were a variation of us, not a rehearsal, but a performance in their own right, complete, complex, and worthy of memory. What defines survival, then, if not simply being here? Consider the bones buried beneath millennia of soil, femurs etched with old injuries that healed, evidence of care. A child's tooth found far from its family's camp, suggesting travel, perhaps adoption. A hand axe left beside a fire pit, sharpened not just for necessity but with a kind of practiced elegance. These are not artifacts of a species scrambling to exist. They are traces of beings who lived with intention. This raises an uncomfortable truth. If Neanderthals were capable of culture, compassion, and symbolic thought, if their lives were shaped by the same forces of love, loss, and hope that shape ours, then their disappearance is not a tale of inevitable replacement. It is a shared tragedy. A branch of humanity withered not because it was weak, but because time did not bend in its favour, and perhaps it was never meant to. The Ice Age was not a single event, but a rhythm of chaos and reprieve. During these cycles, survival was never static. What succeeded in one era would fail in the next. Landscapes shifted, rivers changed course, prey migrated or perished. In this unsteady world, luck mattered as much as skill, and timing, the quiet tyrant of evolution, could be cruel. Homo sapiens arrived in Europe during a window of relative climate stability, bringing new strategies, new genes, and new variables into an already fragile equation. This convergence, not collision, shaped the ending. There was no grand battle, no single extinction event, just the slow narrowing of possibilities, small populations becoming smaller, rituals fading, languages ceasing to be spoken, and eventually the firelight dwindling in the last caves. It wasn't failure, it was erosion, the kind only time can cause. Still, something remarkable occurred in that fading. Where other extinct species leave only bones, Neanderthals left us pieces of themselves. Not just in DNA, but in shared behaviours, ways of making, of thinking, of being. The line between them and us is not clean. It never was. We do not carry their memory as outsiders. We carry it as descendants. This complicates the story. It makes it harder to claim a neat victory. But it also makes the story richer. For survival, we now see, is not only about who continues, but about what continues. And in that sense, the Neanderthals did not disappear entirely. They transformed, and in doing so, they reshaped what it means to survive. Because survival, in the end, is not merely measured in generations or genes. It's measured in how a life, or a lineage, continues to echo long after the breath is gone. It is measured in how traces remain, in tools rediscovered, in alleles passed forward, in stories that linger at the edges of science, myth, and memory. The Neanderthals did not vanish into silence. They entered us. Their DNA lives in the rhythm of our immune systems, in how we respond to viruses, in how we metabolize fat, in the colours of our skin, the curls in our hair, the moods we carry like weather. Even today, when we feel a rush of anxiety or a hidden sensitivity to sunlight, some part of that might be Neanderthal in origin. These are not just curiosities, they are legacies. And there is something poetic in that what began as survival in the cold, the shaping of bodies to withstand wind and ice, became survival in us. That a people whose names we do not know left fingerprints on the bodies of billions, not through conquest but through closeness, through unions, however fleeting, that stitched bloodlines together across species. In that intimacy lies a different kind of victory, one not recorded in dominance but in diffusion. This legacy forces us to reconsider the idea of the last of them. If a species is defined only by its outward shell, by skull shape or limb proportions, then yes, Neanderthals ended. But if a species is also defined by its inner codes, by the messages carried forward in chromosomes and mitochondria, then they are still here, fragmented and refracted, yet real. They were absorbed, not erased. And what of culture, that other thread of legacy? Did Neanderthal ways of seeing and shaping the world influence the humans who followed? Did their songs, if they sang, echo faintly in the songs of our ancestors? Did their pigments, their shelters, their rituals linger in the practices of the newcomers? We may never know the full extent. But every discovery that pushes back against the idea of a cognitive gap, every carved bone, every ochre-stained shell, deepens the mystery and the kinship. Perhaps in the end, survival is not the ability to outlast, but the ability to become part of something greater than oneself, a continuity that bends, that blends, that refuses to be pinned to a single name or form. In this view, extinction is not the end of meaning. It is a transformation of how that meaning is carried. The Neanderthals lit their fires in the dark, unaware that the light would reach this far, but it did. Through us, it still does. In that flicker, still burning across time, we are reminded that survival was never only about being strong, it was about being remembered, and in that they succeeded. They vanished. We did not. And so, we ask the question again, as if asking it harder might reveal something new. Why did the Neanderthals disappear? In their bones, their tools, their ashes and ochre, we see a species remarkably like our own, clever, compassionate, adaptable, a species that lit fires in the dark and hunted giants through snow, a species that shaped tar from birch, stitched hides against the wind, and held the hands of their dead. In them we glimpse not a stranger, but a shadow. And so the mystery deepens. Not because we cannot find the clues, but because we do not like where they point. Because perhaps the answer isn't about them at all. Perhaps it's about us. To stand at the edge of their extinction is to stare into a mirror we rarely choose to face. What happened to them could happen to us. It is not a comfortable thought, not in an age of satellites and servers, not in a world of walls and wonders, but it is a necessary one, because deep time does not promise permanence, because evolution does not write guarantees. Neanderthals endured over 400,000 years of brutal ice age instability, through shifting climates, dying megafauna, encroaching strangers. They adapted, they persisted, until, at last, they didn't. The end was not a meteor strike. It wasn't war or a disease or a singular cataclysmic moment. It was something quieter, a slow drift toward less. Fewer children, fewer places to go, a fading, not a fall. And in that fading lies the truth we avoid, that intelligence does not equal immunity, that the earth does not bend to us forever. We are their descendants, yes, but also their successors. We live in a world of power they could not imagine, skyscrapers, internet, artificial minds, but we still huddle in homes against storms. We still need water, fire, food. The basics have not changed. We've just wrapped them in complexity. And if the wind howled again, if the glaciers crept south, would we know how to begin again? Would we remember how to start the fire? The story of the Neanderthals is often framed as a tragedy. But perhaps it's more of a warning, whispered through time, passed from one kind of human to another. Not a scream, not a panic, just a message. Survival is not owed, even to those who deserve it. And still, they survived far longer than our own species has existed. A reminder that extinction and failure are not the same thing. What if their story is not one of loss, but one of endurance beyond recognition? Then what remains is not the silence of extinction, but the persistence of memory, not fossilized in rock, but held in thought. Because if we remember them, they are not gone. In this light, memory becomes its own form of survival. And so the question shifts, gently but profoundly. What does it mean to be remembered? What does it mean to endure not through stone or flame, but through the minds of those who come after? The Neanderthals, by this measure, are not only fossils, they are teachers. Their story reminds us that vulnerability is not weakness, that to be human, truly human, is to be mortal, dependent, uncertain. It is to live with the knowledge that your world can change without your permission, that no structure, no invention, no culture is immune to time's slow erosion, and yet they kept building, kept moving, kept making meaning, even as the world shifted beneath their feet. It's a kind of quiet courage we rarely celebrate, not conquest, but commitment. The decision, repeated over thousands of years, to wake up in the cold, gather wood, hunt meat, raise children, all while the ice pressed closer and the light grew thin. It was not dramatic. It was daily, and in that daily struggle they defined themselves. We often say that we live in the Anthropocene now, an age shaped by human hands, but they lived in the Pleistocene, an age that shaped them, and still they left their mark. Not in monuments, but in marrow. Not in cities, but in stories we are only now learning how to read. They were not perfect, they did not always thrive, but they endured. They knew what it meant to keep going even when the going gave little in return. And that perhaps is the most human thing of all, because memory in the end is not about data. It is about care. It is the act of carrying something forward, through effort, through attention, through love. And so when we study them, when we imagine their lives with empathy and curiosity, we are not just learning, we are remembering. And that act, that gesture across time, is a kind of kinship. We are no longer just observers of their story. We are participants. They walked into the dark and left the fire burning behind them. We found it. We've kept it alive. And now we face our own long night, climate change, mass extinction, the fraying of global systems, and we ask again, how do we survive? But perhaps the better question is, how do we want to be remembered? Because when we look back at the long arc of human time, it is not the victors who always endure. It is not the builders of towers, nor the wielders of blades. It is those who are held in memory, not for their power, but for their presence, for the way they lived alongside the world, rather than above it. Neanderthals did not ask to be remembered. They did not carve their names into stone, but we remember them anyway because the earth did, because the bones endured, the hearths preserved their ash, the tools kept their edges, and because, in those quiet remnants, we see ourselves. This is the transformation the final chapter requires of us. From curiosity to reflection, from science to story, from analysis to empathy. We began this journey with questions, how they hunted, how they burned fire, how they vanished, but we end it with one that cannot be excavated. What kind of ancestors will we be? The answer doesn't lie in data, it lives in our choices. Will we build structures that can outlast the flood? Or will we leave traces, not just of our technologies, but of our values? Will future minds, whatever shape they take, find echoes of cooperation, of reverence, of care, or will they inherit only ruin? The Neanderthals are gone. Their blood runs in us, yes, but more than that, their pattern haunts our future. They lived through a changing climate and a shrinking range. They faced new arrivals with strange tools and stranger minds. They adapted, but not forever. And neither will we. There is no promise of permanence in the human story. Only the possibility of meaning. To confront this truth is not despair. It is liberation. It is the reminder that what matters most cannot be measured in years or empires, but in the decision to light a fire, to protect a child, to make something beautiful even when no one might see it. The Neanderthals lived that way, not because they believed in eternity, but because that was the only way to live. We carry that inheritance now, in every shared meal, in every circle of warmth, in every memory passed between generations. We repeat their rituals. We become, if only for a moment, mirrors of the people we once were. So the question remains, not what will survive of us, but what deserves to. And if we are brave enough to answer it with humility, not dominance, then perhaps the story doesn't end here. Perhaps it curves forward, into futures we cannot see, held by minds we cannot imagine, who will wonder not just how we lived, but why. In this, memory becomes not an archive, but an inheritance. The Neanderthals left us no scrolls, no monuments, no towering cities, and yet they gave us a question that lingers like smoke in the wind. What does it mean to endure if nothing remembers you? Our ancestors built with silence. They shaped with breath, with gesture, with presence. Their world was carved from cold and patience. In the cracked ribs of a cave hearth, in the soot rising toward forgotten ceilings, there remains a kind of echo, a whisper of continuity between theirs and ours. And though our towers are higher and our tools sharper, that whisper still asks, do you know how fragile you are? The final transformation, then, is not of biology, but of perspective. From the observer, eyes pressed to the glass of ancient time, we become the observed. We become the ones whose tools will rust, whose languages will vanish, whose stories may fade. And in that shift, something humbling occurs. The recognition that we are not the end point of history. We are not the apex. We are a page. A page, yes, but one that is being written now. This is the deep human story, not a ladder, but a web, a spiral, a long unfolding of minds shaped by hunger, by love, by fire. From the first cracked stone to the last transmission into space, the thread that binds us is not supremacy, but vulnerability. We are the species that remembers, that grieves, that hopes, and that is our mirror. The Neanderthals held the cold at bay with fire. We hold chaos at bay with memory. Not the cold wind, perhaps, but the heat of collapse, the storm of disconnection, the numbness of forgetting. When we ask whether we could disappear too, we're not asking about catastrophe. We're asking about meaning, about whether the things that define us, our compassion, our curiosity, our rituals of care, are strong enough to outlast the noise, It is not enough to know we are fragile. We must choose to live as though that fragility is sacred. The Neanderthals did not survive, but in doing so, they taught us how to, not with weapons, but with attention, with collaboration, with the quiet courage to endure when the world grows strange. Now it is our turn to remember them, and in doing so, to remember ourselves. Because if we look honestly into the darkened mirror of deep time, we see not ghosts but kin. And if we listen carefully, we may hear what they left us, not a warning, but an invitation to be worthy of being remembered. This is the quiet demand placed upon every species touched by awareness, that memory becomes responsibility. We carry within us not only the remnants of Neanderthal genes, but the burden of their silence, the silence of those who endured unimaginable hardship, built lives from nothing but stone and instinct, and vanished without fanfare. And now, in their absence, we are left to decide what to do with the story we have inherited. Perhaps that is why the mirror is so hard to face, not because it shows us the end, but because it shows us the beginning. It reminds us that what we call civilization is a recent bloom on ancient roots, that beneath the concrete and circuitry, we are still shaped by the same rhythms: warmth and cold, hunger and kinship, the need for shelter, the ache for meaning. And it asks, quietly but insistently, what will you do with this chance? The story of the Neanderthals is not just about their extinction. It is about the fragility of all existence. It is about how brief presence can be in the deep ledger of time. 1,000 generations of Neanderthals walked the earth. They loved, struggled, dreamed by firelight, and yet they were not remembered until we chose to look. That act of looking back is not just science, it is reverence. Today, as the winds of our own world shift again, through climate, through conflict, through the rapid unravelling of ecological certainty, the mirror grows clearer. Not as a prophecy, but as a reflection. If the glaciers returned, if the lights of our cities flickered out, what would remain? Would anything? And if it did, would anyone understand it? To tell the story of the Neanderthals is to practice humility. It is to know that dominance is not destiny, that intelligence is not immunity, that survival, if it comes at all, must be earned again and again, not through conquest, but through care. And so we arrive, not at an ending, but at an opening. A doorway framed by ash and bone, leading into the long night of the future. What we carry through that door, our memories, our questions, our choices, will shape whether we are remembered as well. Not as giants or gods, but as beings who faced the mirror and did not look away. Because in the end, it is not the fire that keeps us human. It is the story we light with it. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for walking this long road through the ice, for standing in the wind with those who once did, and for witnessing through their story something ancient stir within our own. If this story brought you a quiet sense of wonder, if it offered you stillness, perspective, or a new question to carry, then thank you, and truly, for spending this time with us. I wonder what part of this long tale will echo inside you tonight. Perhaps a flicker of firelight, perhaps the outline of a vanished face, perhaps the weight of silence in a cave no longer visited, whether it was the shimmer of birch tar clinging to a stone blade, the hush of a child buried beneath limestone, or the final fire lit in a cave no one would enter again. These are the fragments that bridge us to them, and to one another. If one image stayed with you, I'd be honoured if you'd share it in the comments, not as noise, but as a quiet offering to this little circle of minds puzzling through the past together. If you felt something here, consider subscribing, liking, or sharing. We'll return soon with another story from deep time. Different bones, different questions, same sky. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful,